For 18 years, Cole Marsh climbed onto Miriam Voss's roof every single time the sky over Ashworth Hollow turned the color of a bruise. And he never once sent her a bill for it. He didn't know she'd once stood in a control room with her hands shaking, while the spacecraft she designed the landing gear for touched down on television screens in 40 countries. He didn't know she'd been called, in a magazine article yellowing now in a box in her attic, the quietest genius in American aerospace. All he knew was that Miriam Voss was 79 years old, lived alone at the end of Larkspur Road in a farmhouse with a roof older than he was, and that every time a nor'easter or a summer squall line came barreling down out of Canada, that roof needed somebody up on it before the rain found its way into her kitchen ceiling again. So he went. Spring storms, summer storms, the wet, heavy snow that some winters brought before Thanksgiving even arrived. 18 years of storm seasons, more ladder trips than he had ever bothered to count, and he never asked her for a dime, because somewhere in the plain arithmetic of his own life, fixing Miriam Voss's roof for free had simply become one of the fixed points around which everything else got scheduled. The way you don't charge your own grandmother, the way some debts aren't really debts at all, they're just love wearing a tool belt. My name is Cole Marsh. I am 40 years old, and I've made my living with my hands in this town since I was 19, which is longer than some of the people who hire me have been alive. I want to tell you what happened the autumn. I finally found out who Miriam Voss really was and what she left behind when she was gone, because it changed the shape of my whole life, and it nearly broke my family before it healed anything. And I think you should hear all of it, the ugly parts included, because a story with only the pretty parts in it isn't really a true story at all. But first, you need to understand who I was before any of this started, and who she was to me before I knew the first thing about who she'd been to the rest of the world, because none of what follows will make sense unless you believe that part first. The plain, unglamorous truth that I climbed onto that woman's roof for 18 years, simply because she was old and alone, and the roof leaked, and for no other reason on this earth. I grew up in Ashworth Hollow, a town of about 2,600 people tucked into a fold of the Green Mountains, where the road signs still get shot up for target practice, and the general store still runs a tab for half the county. My father, Russell Marsh, was the town's handyman before me, the man everybody called when a pipe froze or a porch step gave way or a chimney needed repointing before winter, and I rode in his truck from about the age of 7, holding flashlights and fetching tools and learning, without ever being formally taught that the measure of a man in a town like this one wasn't what he owned, it was what he could fix and whether he showed up when the weather turned bad. My mother, Donna, cut hair out of a converted mudroom on the side of our house, and between the two of them we were what you'd call comfortable in the specific, modest way. That means the lights stayed on and there was always something on the stove, but there was no fat in the budget, not ever. And there wasn't a year of my childhood where a broken transmission or a bad flu season didn't turn into a genuine crisis around our kitchen table. My father died when I was 22, a heart attack on a Tuesday morning while he was loading the truck for a job, and I buried him and inherited his tools and his client list and his reputation in the same season, which is a lot for a 22-year-old to carry, though I didn't fully understand that at the time. I just did the next thing and the next thing after that, the way you do when grief hasn't caught up with you yet. Miriam Voss had been one of my father's clients for as long as I could remember. And I want to tell you honestly that as a kid, I found her a little frightening in the specific way that quiet, precise old women can be frightening to a boy who mostly knew loudness. She didn't fuss over me the way some of my father's other clients didn't offer cookies or ask about school. She just watched, closely, whatever we were doing, whether it was replacing a gutter or rewiring an outlet, with an attention that felt less like nosiness and more like she was actually genuinely interested in the mechanics of it, which struck me even then as unusual in a woman her age, though I didn't have the words for why at 9 years old. I met my wife, Renee, at the Ashworth Hollow Volunteer Fire Department's summer pancake breakfast, which is about as unglamorous an origin story as a marriage can have, and I have told people that story at parties for 9 years now and watched it land exactly the same modest way every single time, which I've come to enjoy rather than resent. She was pouring syrup, I was flipping pancakes because my mother had roped me into helping, and she looked at me and said, "You're burning that one," with an authority that startled me into actually looking down at the griddle. And I remember thinking, with the sudden clean clarity you get maybe 3 times in your whole life about anything, that I was going to marry this woman. It took me 4 more months to work up the nerve to ask her to dinner, and Renee still tells people I was slower to admit I liked her than any man she's ever met, which is probably true, but I've always been the kind of man who measures twice and cuts once, in carpentry and in everything else. We got married 10 years ago at the same volunteer fire department, which felt right, and my mother cried through the whole ceremony, and Renee's father, who drives a snowplow for the town in winter and does landscaping the rest of the year, gave a toast so short and so sincere that half the room was in tears by the end of it. 4 sentences total, the last one being, "Renee, you found a man who shows up, and in this family that is the whole ball game." We have 2 kids, Tucker, who is 8 and has opinions about excavators that could fill an encyclopedia, and Birdie, who is 5 and named for the fact that Renee went into labor with her during a bird-watching walk on the rail trail behind our house, 3 weeks early, which is a story Renee tells better than I ever could. We live in a small house on Cobble Hill Road that I have been slowly rebuilding since we bought it, 1 room at a time, in the hours between paying jobs, and we drive a truck with the check engine light more or less permanently illuminated. And some months, especially the slow ones between the fall leaf-peeping work and the spring thaw work, we sit at our own kitchen table and do the same kind of careful math that I imagine every working family in a town like this one does, figuring out which bill can wait another 2 weeks and which one genuinely cannot. I tell you all of this because it matters enormously to what comes later, and because I want you to understand exactly how little room there actually was, in a real dollars and cents sense, for me to be climbing onto an elderly widow's roof for free, 18 times a year some years, for the better part of 2 decades. It was never money we had to spare. It was time and sweat we decided every single storm season that we had enough of to give away. The roof at the end of Larkspur Road first became my responsibility, rather than my father's, in the spring after he died, when an April nor'easter tore 3 courses of shingles clean off the north slope of Miriam Voss's farmhouse, and I got the call, still grieving, still getting used to being the one people called instead of my father. I remember driving out there in his truck, which was now my truck, in weather that any sensible person would have stayed home in, because that was simply what you did when Miriam Voss's roof came apart in a storm. My father had done it for 15 years before me, and I intended to keep doing it, and I remember climbing that ladder soaked to the skin, 22 years old and still raw with losing him, and finding her standing at the bottom, holding the ladder steady with both hands, even though her doctor had almost certainly told her not to be outside. In weather like that, at her age, looking up at me with an expression I didn't fully understand yet, and saying, "Your father would be proud of you, Cole," which is the exact sentence I needed to hear on that particular morning, and had no way of knowing I needed until she said it. She never asked me to charge her less. She never asked me to charge her at all, if I'm honest, in the sense that the first time I finished that emergency repair and started writing up an invoice out of habit, she waved her hand at me, this small, precise gesture like she was dismissing a fact rather than a bill, and said, "Cole, your father never charged me for storm repairs, not once in 15 years, and I don't imagine you're about to start a new tradition on the day you buried him." I didn't fully understand what she meant, and I remember asking her, a little awkwardly, why my father had made that arrangement, and she looked at me for a long moment with those sharp gray eyes of hers, the kind of eyes that made you feel like you were being measured for something, and said, "Because your father understood that some kindnesses aren't really kindnesses at all. They're just maintenance on something worth keeping," and left it at that. In the specific, unhurried way she left most things at that. A woman who clearly had more behind her sentences than she ever put into them. So it became mine. the way things become yours in a small town, not through any formal agreement, but through 18 years of simple repetition. Every storm season, spring and summer and the wet early winter storms before the ground froze hard, I checked that roof, patched what needed patching, replaced what needed replacing, and never once sent Miriam Voss a bill for any of it. My mother, when I told her about the arrangement in the first year, said what I imagine most people would say, "Cole, you can't run a business giving away free labor to everyone your father liked." And I remember telling her, and meaning it, that it wasn't about liking her. Though I did, genuinely. It was about the plain fact that she was 79 years old and lived alone at the end of a dirt road a mile from her nearest neighbor. And if I didn't fix that roof for free, in a town where nobody had much money to spare, there was a real chance nobody would fix it at all. And a woman that age could not afford, in every sense of that word, to live under a roof that leaked into her kitchen every time the wind came up out of the northwest. I should describe Miriam Voss's farmhouse itself, because it is not an incidental detail in this story. It is very nearly a character in it. It sits at the very end of Larkspur Road, past where the town stops plowing in earnest and the driveways get longer and lonelier. A white clapboard house with black shutters that her husband, Walter Voss, bought in the early 1970s when land out there was cheap and nobody with any sense wanted to live that far from town. The house has 4 bedrooms she never had reason to fill, a barn out back that hasn't held an animal in 40 years, and instead holds, as I would only discover much later, several locked steel filing cabinets and a workbench cleaner, and more precisely organized than my own, and an attic she asked me every few years to check for water damage. An attic I climbed into a dozen times over 18 years without ever once looking closely at the boxes stacked along its far wall. Because that is not the kind of thing you do in another person's house. You fix what you were called to fix, and you leave the rest alone. And I want to be honest that this discretion, this specific handyman's instinct to see only the water stain and not the boxes beside it, is probably the reason it took me 18 years to learn who she actually was. Miriam kept to herself in the particular way that gets described in a small town as either standoffish or eccentric, depending on who's doing the describing. She did her own grocery shopping at the market on Main Street every Wednesday morning, precisely at 9, and was polite but brief with the cashiers, and she did not attend church, and she did not join the garden club that half the older women in town belonged to, and for years the working theory around Ashworth Hollow, as far as there was one, was that she'd simply never gotten over losing her husband and had shrunk her whole life down to the size of what she could manage alone. Walter Voss had died over 40 years earlier, when Miriam was still relatively early in her career, in what the old-timers described vaguely as an accident connected to his work that none of them seemed to know very much about beyond the fact that he'd traveled constantly and worked, as one old-timer put it to me once, on airplanes or rockets or something out west, though nobody in Ashworth Hollow had ever pressed Miriam for details. Because that is also a rule in a town like this one. You do not press a grieving widow for the specifics of a grief that is none of your business. I want to tell you about the first time I noticed something didn't quite add up about Miriam Voss, because it happened years before the real revelation, and I've thought about it often since, wondering why I never followed the thread further at the time. I was up in her attic checking for ice dam damage, maybe 8 years into fixing that roof, and I set my knee down wrong on a loose board and put my hand out to catch myself, and my hand landed on the edge of one of those boxes I mentioned, knocking the lid half off, and inside, before I straightened it back up out of simple embarrassment at having disturbed anything, I saw the edge of a photograph, black and white, of a woman standing in front of what I would have sworn, in that half-second glimpse, was some kind of enormous curved metal structure, a fuselage or a rocket body, with a row of men in white shirts and thin, dark ties standing near her, looking at a clipboard she was holding. I didn't look further. I put the lid back exactly as it had been, finished checking the ice dam damage, and climbed back down the ladder. And when Miriam asked if everything looked all right up there, I said, "Yes, ma'am," same as any other year, and did not mention the box, because it was not mine to ask about. and some small, ordinary part of me simply filed it away as, that's a little unusual, and then filed it nowhere at all, the way you do with most small mysteries in other people's attics. Renee, I should say, had her own relationship with Miriam Voss that ran on a slightly different track than mine. Where I saw her once or twice a season, always with a ladder involved, Renee had gotten to know her more gradually over the years through the library, where Renee volunteers 2 mornings a week shelving returns, because Miriam came in every other Wednesday after her grocery run and checked out, without fail, either a physics text or a biography of some scientist Renee had usually never heard of, and the two of them had developed the specific, unhurried friendship that grows up around a shared interest neither party makes a big production of. Renee mentioned to me once, years back, that Miriam Voss knew more about orbital mechanics than any woman she'd ever met who wasn't actually employed doing something with orbital mechanics, and I remember laughing and saying, "Well, she reads a lot of books, honey," and Renee giving me a look that, in retrospect, I should have paid more attention to. A look that said she suspected there was more to it than casual reading, though neither of us pursued it, because in Ashworth Hollow you let people be who they're going to be. And Miriam Voss had clearly decided, for reasons of her own, to be a quiet old woman who read library books about rockets and kept to herself at the end of a dirt road. The years move the way years do when you're running a small business and raising small children, which is to say both impossibly slow in any single week and shockingly fast when you look back at the whole stretch of it. Tucker went from a baby who wouldn't sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch to the specific, confident 8-year-old he is now, capable of explaining the difference between a hydraulic excavator and a backhoe loader to anyone who'll stand still long enough to listen. Birdie arrived 3 weeks early during that bird-watching walk, small and furious and healthy, and grew into the kind of 5-year-old who names every animal she sees, including, memorably, 3 separate groundhogs that live under our porch, and that she insists are a family. My mother's hip started giving her trouble about 6 years ago, and she finally had it replaced 4 years back, a surgery we worried over for a solid year before she'd agree to schedule it, because like a lot of people in this town, she'd rather live with pain than admit she needed help, and she's walking better now than she has in a decade, though she'll never quite admit the surgery was the reason. Through all of it. Every storm season, spring and summer and the wet early winter, I drove out to the end of Larkspur Road, climbed Miriam Voss's ladder, fixed what needed fixing, and drove home again. Never billing her. Never really thinking hard about why. Because by then, it wasn't a decision anymore. It was simply who I was in that specific situation, the same way you don't decide, fresh every morning, to brush your teeth. You just do it because it's become part of the architecture of who you are. I want to tell you about the storm 4 years ago that came closest to changing my mind about the arrangement, because I think it matters. And because I've turned it over in my head more times in the last few months than almost any other single afternoon in this whole story. It was a genuinely brutal spring, and Tucker had come down with a respiratory infection bad enough to need 2 rounds of antibiotics and a chest x-ray at the hospital in the next county over. And between the co-pays and a slow stretch of paying work and a transmission repair on the truck that ate almost everything we'd managed to save that winter, Renee and I were, for the first time in our marriage, seriously behind on the propane bill, the actual shut-off notice kind of behind. And I remember standing in our own kitchen on a Tuesday evening when the call came in from Miriam, her roof again, a bad one this time, and some small, tired, frightened part of me thought, not this week. Just this once, I can't afford to spend a whole Saturday climbing a ladder for free when I could be taking a paying job instead. And I sat with that thought for the length of 1 whole minute, which felt much longer, doing the math in my head, propane, Tucker's follow-up appointment, the transmission repair still not fully paid off, and for the first time in 18 years, I genuinely did not know what I was going to say when I called her back. And then I thought about my father, who never once, in 15 years of doing exactly what I was now doing, mentioned to me that it cost him anything. Though of course it must have. Every unpaid Saturday cost him something in a real countable sense. And I thought about Miriam Voss standing at the bottom of that ladder, holding it steady with both hands the very first time I climbed it. the day I buried my father, saying, "Your father would be proud of you, Cole." And I thought, if I let this be the year I decide the math doesn't work anymore, what exactly am I actually saving? A Saturday's paying work against a propane bill I could not fully solve with one Saturday's paying work anyway. I called her back within the hour and told her I'd be out first thing in the morning, same as always. And she said, in that dry, precise way she had, "I never doubted you would be, Cole," which at the time I took as simple confidence in my character, and which I would only understand months later as something considerably more specific than that. I drove out there that Saturday, fixed the roof in weather that soaked me through twice over, and drove home with nothing in my pocket for it, and Renee met me at the door with a look I knew well by then, part exhaustion, part quiet pride. And she didn't say anything about the propane bill. She just handed me a towel and said, "Go warm up." I made soup, and we figured the propane out the way we always figured things out. A little late, a little painfully, but we figured it out. And I tell you this not because it's the most dramatic moment in this story. It very much is not. But because I think it's the truest one. And because I want anyone listening who has ever quietly kept up a kindness through a stretch when they genuinely couldn't afford to know that I understand exactly how that feels, and that it is not free, and it is not always easy, and the people who do it are not saints. They are just ordinary people who have decided, over and over, in small moments nobody is watching, what kind of person they are going to be. Life went on the way it does, in a long, unremarkable string of storm seasons, until this past October, when Miriam Voss called me on a Tuesday afternoon in a voice I had never once heard her use in 18 years, a voice with none of the dry, precise briskness I associated with her, a voice that sounded, if anything, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and something to do with a decision finally being made after a long time of putting it off. And she said, "Cole, I need about an hour of your time, and I don't mean the roof. I think you should come sit down with me. I should tell you about the specific dread that settled into my stomach when she said that, because it wasn't curiosity, not at first. It was fear, the kind that goes straight to your gut before your brain has caught up with a reason for it. Because in 18 years, Miriam Voss had never once asked me to come sit down with her. Our entire relationship had been conducted on ladders and in driveways and through brief exchanges at her kitchen door. And my first thought, God help me, was that she was sick, that this was the kind of conversation people have when a doctor has given them a number of months rather than a number of years. And I remember driving out to Larkspur Road that evening with my hands tight on the wheel and Renee's voice in my head asking me, when I called to tell her where I was going, "Do you want me to come?" And me saying no. I think this is something she wants to tell me alone, though I couldn't have told you why I thought that at the time. She met me at the door, which she never did. She usually just left the storm door unlocked and called out from wherever she was in the house. And she had made coffee. Real coffee in a percolator that looked older than my truck, and she sat me down at her kitchen table, the same table I had glimpsed 100 times through the window while checking gutters, but had never actually sat at. And she folded her hands in front of her, this composed, deliberate gesture, and looked at me with those sharp gray eyes, steadier than I expected given how tired her voice had sounded on the phone, and she said, "Cole, I am going to tell you something about myself that almost no one in this town knows, and I need you to let me finish the whole thing before you say anything, because if I stop partway through, I don't know that I'll have the nerve to start again." I told her, of course, and she began in that same clear, unhurried voice. A voice I would come to understand was the voice of a woman who had once given technical briefings to rooms full of engineers and executives and had never entirely lost the habit of laying out facts in careful, load-bearing order. She said, "My name, as you know, is Miriam Voss, but for 26 years, before I came to this town, I was known in a considerably smaller and more particular circle than this one as Dr. Miriam Voss, and I was the lead structural engineer, and for the last 11 of those years, the chief of flight systems integration, at a company called Halcyon Aerodynamics, where I designed, among a great many other things, the landing gear assembly for 3 different generations of American spacecraft, including the system that brought the Halcyon orbital return vehicle back down onto a runway in the Mojave Desert in front of television cameras in 61 countries in 1979, an event you have very likely seen footage of at some point in your life without ever knowing that the woman who kept that vehicle from disintegrating into the tarmac was, 40 years later, the same woman who calls you every spring about her roof. I want to be honest that in that moment, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of percolator coffee going cold in front of me, I did not fully understand what she was telling me, not because the words were complicated, but because the person saying them was a 79-year-old widow in a cardigan in a farmhouse at the end of a dirt road in rural Vermont, and the story she was telling me belonged, in my head, to a completely different category of person. The kind you see in documentaries, not the kind whose gutters you clean. She must have seen some of that confusion on my face, because she reached over to the sideboard behind her, without getting up, and pulled out a thin leather folder I would later learn she kept exactly for moments like this one, and opened it on the table between us, and inside were photographs. Actual photographs, black and white, and then color, as the decades in them progressed, of a much younger Miriam Voss in a lab coat, in a control room, standing at a podium in front of a room full of men in narrow ties, holding what I recognized, from the world I actually understood, as a technical drawing of some kind of hinge or strut assembly, except scaled up to the size of something that clearly needed to survive contact with a runway at several hundred miles an hour. I sat there and looked at those photographs for what felt like a very long time, and the one thing I kept coming back to, the detail that made the whole impossible thing suddenly physically real to me, was a photograph of her at what must have been 30 years old, kneeling next to an enormous curved piece of metal with a wrench in her hand and grease on her forearm, laughing at something outside the frame. And I recognized that posture, that specific way of kneeling next to a piece of equipment with a tool in your hand like you belong there, because it is exactly how I kneel next to a furnace or a water heater. And something in my chest loosened at that recognition, some instinct that had been quietly panicking since she opened that folder. Because I thought, whatever else this woman is, she is also, underneath all of it, someone who has gotten her hands dirty, fixing something with a wrench, and that, at least, I understood completely. She told me the story slowly, over the better part of an hour, and I am going to tell it to you the way she told it to me, because I have turned it over so many times since that I could probably recite parts of it word for word. She had grown up in a mill town in western Massachusetts, the daughter of a machinist father who taught her, against every convention of the era, to read blueprints before she was 10 years old, and she had gone to engineering school in the early 1960s as one of perhaps 4 women in a program of 200. And had been told more than once by professors who meant it as something between a joke and a warning that she would never be hired to design anything more complicated than a toaster. She was hired instead in 1964 by a small aerospace contractor in California that would eventually grow into Halcyon Aerodynamics, hired specifically, she suspected even then, because the company was desperate enough for structural engineers during the early space race that they were willing to overlook the fact that she was a woman, an oversight she said she never once let them regret. She met Walter Voss in her second year at Halcyon. He was a test pilot, one of the small, close-knit fraternity of men who flew experimental aircraft and landing vehicles before they were declared safe for anyone else, and she told me, with a small, private smile that I understood immediately was decades of grief worn down into something closer to fondness, that Walter was the only man at that company who ever treated her technical opinions as more important than her legs, a phrase she delivered so dryly that I actually laughed out loud before I caught myself, and she waved a hand to tell me it was all right to laugh, that Walter would have laughed too. They married in 1966, and for the better part of 2 decades, they built parallel careers at the same company. Her designing the systems, him testing them, a partnership she described as the best professional and personal decision of her entire life. And then, in 1983, 4 years after her landing gear system carried the orbital return vehicle safely onto that runway in the Mojave in front of the whole world, Walter Voss died testing an experimental descent module that had not, in fact, incorporated the specific structural revision Miriam had recommended 6 weeks earlier, a revision the program director had tabled for cost reasons, a decision she said she's turned over in her mind roughly every single day for the last 42 years without ever once landing anywhere close to peace about it. She stayed at Halcyon for 11 more years after Walter died, she told me, rising to Chief of Flight Systems Integration, the highest technical position a non-executive engineer could hold at that company. And by every outward measure, those 11 years should have been the peak of her professional life. And in a narrow, technical sense they were. But she said something to me at that kitchen table that I have not been able to stop thinking about since, which is that success achieved entirely to outrun grief eventually stops feeling like success and starts feeling like a very sophisticated form of running. And by 1994, at the age of 52, with more patents to her name than she could recite from memory, and a corner office, and a reputation that still, decades later, made grown engineers go quiet when her name came up in certain rooms, she resigned from Halcyon Aerodynamics entirely, sold the house she and Walter had shared in California, and moved 3,000 miles away to a state she had visited exactly once for a conference 20 years earlier, because she remembered the mountains being the first thing in a very long time that had made her feel small in a good way, rather than a frightening one. She bought the farmhouse at the end of Larkspur Road specifically because it was far enough from town that no one would have any particular reason to look her up, and specifically because, she told me with a dryness that had a real edge of pain underneath it, she had discovered in her last years at Halcyon exactly what happens to a woman's friendships and social invitations once people learn the size of her salary and the number of patents attached to her name, which is that the friendships thin out considerably, and the invitations start arriving from people who want something rather than people who simply enjoy her company. And she had decided, arriving in Ashworth Hollow at 52 years old with no children of her own, and a grief she had never fully processed, that she would rather be a slightly odd private woman in a small Vermont town who nobody quite understood than go through the specific, exhausting calculus of figuring out who in a new city wanted to know Miriam Voss the widow and who wanted to know Dr. Voss, the aerospace executive, with, by then, a personal fortune large enough to require its own management. I want to pause here and tell you what I felt hearing that particular detail, because it is the moment the whole conversation tilted, for me, from a fascinating revelation about my quiet elderly client into something considerably more disorienting. Because the phrase personal fortune large enough to require its own management is not a phrase that fits naturally into a sentence about a woman whose roof I have been patching for free for 18 years. And I remember actually setting my coffee cup down because my hand had started to feel unsteady. And I said, without much grace, "Miriam, how much money are we actually talking about?" And she looked at me evenly and said, "As of this past summer's accounting, after taxes, after the trust structures my lawyers insisted on decades ago, somewhere in the neighborhood of $290 million, most of it in Halcyon stock I never sold because I never needed the money and never trusted myself to spend it wisely if I did, and some considerable additional amount in patents that are still licensed today in landing systems for aircraft you have very likely flown on without ever knowing my name, was attached to the mechanism keeping the wheels attached to the plane." I sat with that number for what felt like a genuinely embarrassing length of silence, and the thought that finally broke through, the same way it apparently breaks through for everyone in stories like this one, was not really about the money at all. It was, "You asked me to check your roof for water stains every single autumn for 18 years. And I did, thinking I was doing you a favor. And something about the sheer scale of the mismatch between that small, ordinary task and the number she had just said out loud made a strange, stunned laugh come out of me before I could stop it. And Miriam Voss laughed too, an actual real laugh, warmer than any sound I had heard out of her in 18 years, and said, Yes, Cole. Yes, precisely. That is rather the whole point of the last 18 years, if I'm honest with you. She told me then why she had specifically chosen to tell me all of this now, in October, at 79 years old, at her own kitchen table. And it was considerably more than a simple confession of a hidden past. It was, as she put it, the beginning of a conversation she'd been quietly circling for the better part of a decade and had finally run out of reasons to keep postponing. She said, "Cole, I have watched you for 18 years. Not simply on the roof, though I have watched that too, closely, more closely than you probably realized, because I know precision when I see it, and you work with a precision that has nothing to do with formal training and everything to do with genuine respect for the material in front of you, which is a rarer quality than you'd think in any field, mine included. But I have also watched you build a life. I watched you bury your father and take up his exact trade without a single day of feeling sorry for yourself about it, at least not where anyone could see. I watched you marry a woman who corrected your pancake technique within 5 minutes of meeting you, which I heard about, incidentally, from Renee herself, who tells that story at the library with considerably more flourish than you probably do. I watched you raise 2 children who, every single time I have seen them in town, look at you the way children look at a father who is actually present, which is not a universal experience, whatever people like to pretend. And I have watched you fix my roof every single storm season without ever once being asked twice, without ever once padding an invoice you weren't even submitting for 18 years. For no reason I could ever fully explain to my own satisfaction, except that you had apparently decided, the way your father decided before you, that some people are worth showing up for regardless of what it costs you. I asked her, because it seemed like the obvious question, and also the one I most needed answered, why any of that mattered to a woman with $290 million who had spent 30 years successfully avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement with anyone in this town. And she was quiet for a long moment. Turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, the way I would later learn, was a habit of hers when she was choosing words with unusual care, and said, "Because, Cole, I am 79 years old. I have no children. Walter has been gone 42 years, and everyone who ever truly understood the engineering I spent my life on is either dead or retired somewhere I've lost track of. And I have reached the specific, unglamorous point in a long life where the question stops being, what do I want to build, and starts being, what do I want to leave, and to whom? And I have thought about that question for the better part of 10 years without arriving at any answer that felt honest, until I realized, somewhere in the last 2 or 3 storm seasons, that I had already answered it without meaning to, every single April and every single August, by handing my roof over to the one person in this entire town who has never once treated kindness as a transaction to be settled later. I want to describe the specific silence that followed that sentence, because I have replayed it more times than almost any other moment in my life, sitting there at that kitchen table with a cooling cup of percolator coffee, a stunned handyman who had walked in expecting, at absolute worst, to learn his elderly client was dying, and instead had learned she had spent 4 decades as one of the most significant aerospace engineers of her generation, and was now, in some fashion I did not yet understand, about to tell me that some meaningful portion of a 9-figure fortune had my name attached to it. And I remember the first fully formed thought that made it through the vertigo, and it surprised me, because it wasn't about the money at all. It was, I need to call Renee. Not because I needed her permission. We've never operated that way in 10 years of marriage. But because in every hard conversation and every strange piece of news I have ever had to sit with, she has been standing next to me for the working out of it, and it did not feel like something I was allowed to carry alone, not even for one evening. Miriam must have seen that thought cross my face, because she said, without my having to ask, call her Cole. Call her from right here if you'd like. I would actually prefer it, because whatever gets decided about the rest of what I have to tell you, I would like Renee's steadiness in the room for it, and I want to say that detail struck me as significant even in the middle of all that vertigo, because I realized, sitting there, that Miriam Voss had thought about my family with considerably more specificity than I had assumed, that this was not some impulsive gesture from a lonely old woman, but the product of years of quiet observation. And I called Renee from Miriam's kitchen phone, an actual corded phone mounted on the wall that I hadn't seen the likes of since childhood, and told her, as evenly as I could manage, that she needed to come out to Larkspur Road, that everything was fine, nobody was sick, but she needed to come now. And Renee, God bless her, did not ask a single question. She simply said, "I'm getting Tucker and Bertie into the truck. Be there in 15 minutes, which is exactly the kind of steadiness that made me fall for her over a griddle of burning pancakes 7 years earlier. When Renee arrived, kids in tow, because we had no sitter arranged and this could not wait, Miriam insisted the children come inside rather than wait in the truck, and I watched something soften in her face. Watching Tucker examine her percolator with the specific 8-year-old fascination he reserves for any mechanical object he doesn't yet understand, and watching Bertie ask, with total 5-year-old bluntness, if Miriam was a witch, because she lived alone at the end of a scary road, a question Miriam answered with more delight than offense, telling Bertie in the driest possible tone that she supposed some people might call what she used to do a kind of witchcraft, though the technical term was aerospace structural engineering, which sailed entirely over Bertie's head and made Tucker, who apparently knew the word aerospace from some documentary he'd half-watched, go very quiet and very wide-eyed. Once the kids were settled at the kitchen table with cookies Miriam produced from a tin I hadn't known existed in 18 years of visiting that house, she told Renee the same story she'd told me, the abbreviated version this time, Halcyon Walter, the landing gear, the $290 million, and I watched Renee's face do the same journey mine had done an hour earlier, shock sliding into disbelief, sliding into a kind of stunned respect. And when Miriam got to the number, Renee, in a moment, "I will treasure for the rest of my life," said out loud without any filter at all, "Well, that explains why you always seem too smart to be just a lady who reads library books about rockets." And Miriam laughed so hard she had to set down her coffee cup and said, "Renee, in 18 years, you are the closest anyone in this town has ever come to simply saying the quiet part out loud, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." Then Miriam told us what she actually wanted to do, and it was considerably more than either of us expected, and considerably more, I'll admit, than either of us initially felt entirely comfortable accepting. She told us that she had been working quietly with lawyers in Boston for the better part of 2 years on the structure of what she intended to leave behind, because she had no children, no living siblings, and the last of Walter's direct family, a brother, had passed away nearly 20 years earlier, and she had decided, well before she ever worked up the nerve to tell me any of this at her kitchen table, that the bulk of her estate was going to fund something she was calling, in the draft paperwork, the Voss Aerodynamics Legacy Trust, a foundation meant to do 2 specific things. The first was to endow full technical scholarships, in perpetuity, for young people from small, overlooked towns, exactly like Ashworth Hollow who wanted to pursue engineering but lacked the resources or the connections that a kid from a bigger, wealthier school district would have taken for granted. Because, she said, looking directly at me when she said it, "I spent my entire career being underestimated by people who assumed a certain kind of background produced a certain kind of engineer, and I have no interest in leaving behind a fortune that quietly reinforces that same assumption for the next 60 years. The second thing," she said, and here her voice slowed down in the specific way that told us we had arrived at the part she'd rehearsed least, was that she wanted to establish a smaller, separate fund, specifically for skilled trades, because she said something to me that I have not stopped thinking about since, which is that in 40 years around some of the most credentialed engineers in the country, the single quality she valued most in any of them, more than the degrees, more than the patents, was the same quality she'd watched in me on a ladder for 18 years, which is an instinct for taking care of things properly even when nobody's checking your work. and she wanted a fund that specifically supported young tradespeople, plumbers and electricians and carpenters and roofers, kids who weren't going to college but were going to spend their lives fixing things other people depended on. Kids exactly like I had been at 19 when I inherited my father's tools, and she wanted, she said, for that fund to be administered, at least initially, by me. Not because I needed a job, my business was doing fine, but because she trusted no one else in Ashworth Hollow, or frankly, in Boston, to actually understand which young tradespeople genuinely deserved it and which ones simply interviewed well. And then, she said more quietly, there was the matter of the house itself, and the barn, and what was in it. And here she paused for the first time in the whole conversation. And I watched something cross her face that I would only later understand as 40 years of careful compartmentalization, finally being asked to open all the way. And she said, "Cole, Renee, there are things in that barn I have shown no one in 30 years. Technical papers, correspondence with Walter from before we married, patents I filed but never fully exploited because pursuing them further would have meant returning to exactly the kind of public life I moved here specifically to escape. I want you to have access to all of it, not simply as an inheritance, but because I think, Cole, that you are precisely the kind of person who will actually look at those blueprints and understand what they meant to build, rather than simply appraising them for auction value. And I have not been able to say that about a single other person in my life since Walter died. I want to be honest about what Renee and I did that first night, driving home with 2 sleepy children in the back seat who had eaten entirely too many cookies because it was not the simple, uncomplicated joy you might expect from a story like this. We sat at our own kitchen table after the kids were finally down, well past midnight, and we did something we had done before, during smaller crises, which is make 2 lists on opposite sides of the same sheet of paper, one for what scared us and one for what we actually wanted, because Renee said, and she was only half joking, if we don't write down what we're afraid of first, we're going to end up making decisions out of fear dressed up as gratitude, and neither of us will notice until it's too late to undo it. The fear list came first, and it was longer than either of us expected. I wrote, what if people in this town start treating our kids differently because of a number attached to our name that has nothing to do with anything either of us actually built? What if I stop being able to tell the difference between a job I take because I love the work and a job I take because I no longer technically need the money, and lose something about myself in the process that I won't notice is gone until years later? What if administering this trade fund turns into a job I resent, the way even good things can curdle into obligations if you're not careful? Renee added her own. What if Tucker and Bertie grow up assuming that this is simply how families work, that a wealthy stranger eventually solves your hardest problems, instead of understanding that what actually happened here took 18 years of a decision nobody was watching? What if the whole town decides Miriam only told us because she was lonely and vulnerable, and turns this into a story about an old woman being taken advantage of, instead of what it actually is? What if this changes how you feel driving out to that farmhouse every storm season, and it stops being the thing you do because you love her, and starts being the thing people assume you do because of what you might get? Then we made the want list, and it was shorter, which surprised us both. We wanted Tucker and Bertie to grow up understanding, specifically and concretely, that this happened because their father showed up for 18 years expecting nothing back, not because good fortune simply finds people. We wanted the trade fund to actually work, to actually put tool belts and trade school tuition into the hands of kids in towns like ours who would otherwise never get the chance, more than we wanted any particular dollar figure attached to our own names. We wanted Miriam, whatever years she had left, to spend them exactly as unbothered and unwatched as she had spent the last 30, just with slightly less loneliness in it than before, if we could manage that. And we wanted, and this one surprised me coming out of my own mouth, for my mother, who had cut hair in a converted mudroom for 40 years and never once complained about her hands aching by the end of a long Saturday, to have some kind of easier stretch of years ahead of her. If we were in a position to make that happen, That was the whole list, 4 items, against a fear list nearly 3 times as long, and I remember looking at that lopsided page and thinking, this is either proof we're going to be all right with whatever comes next, or it's the last honest conversation we have before all of this changes us anyway. I choose months later to believe it was the first one. I called Miriam 2 days after that kitchen table conversation, and I read her almost exactly what I've just told you, the fear list and the want list both, because I did not want to negotiate with her the way you negotiate with someone trying to sell you something. I wanted her to understand the actual shape of what Renee and I could hold without it changing who we were. She listened without interrupting the whole way through, and when I finished, she was quiet long enough that I asked if she was still on the line, and she said, "Cole, in 40 years of engineering reviews and budget meetings, I have sat across from executives who wanted 8-figure line items and dressed their ambition up as necessity to make it sound better in a board presentation. You just read me a fear list longer than your want list, unprompted, and asked for considerably less than I had already decided to give you. I am going to structure this almost exactly according to that second list, because you are the only person who has ever correctly understood, in front of me, that more is not automatically the same thing as better, and that, more than any patent I ever filed, is the closest thing to a genuinely elegant piece of engineering I have encountered in longer than I can remember. We spent the following 6 weeks working through the details, slowly, carefully, with a lawyer named Priscilla Ahn, who flew up from Boston twice to sit at that same kitchen table, and I want to tell you honestly that it was not the simple, uncomplicated unfolding you might imagine from the outside, because setting up a $290 million trust involves considerably more paperwork and considerably more scrutiny than either Renee or I had ever encountered in our lives. And there were entire afternoons that felt less like receiving a gift and more like being slowly, carefully audited, which in a sense we were, because Priscilla Ahn's job, she told us plainly on her first visit, was not to make us feel good about any of this. It was to make sure that whatever Miriam Voss decided to do with her estate would hold up legally and publicly against absolutely anyone who might later try to take it apart. I should have paid closer attention to that specific warning, because 6 weeks later, almost to the day, someone did try to take it apart, and the person who tried was someone none of us had given very much thought to at all, which in hindsight was its own kind of mistake. Walter Voss's only brother, Harold, had died nearly 20 years earlier, as Miriam had told us, but Harold had a son, Miriam's nephew by marriage, a man named Grady Voss Pemberton, who had taken his mother's maiden name onto his own, somewhere in his 30s, for reasons Miriam said she'd never fully understood. And Grady, now in his early 60s, lived in Hartford, Connecticut, ran a moderately successful commercial insurance brokerage, and had, by Miriam's own account, visited her exactly 4 times in the 30 years since she'd moved to Ashworth Hollow, always around a holiday, always with a specific, transparent warmth that increased noticeably whenever the subject of her health or her estate planning came up in even the most oblique way. Miriam had never disliked Grady. Exactly, she told me later. She had simply never mistaken his attention for anything other than what it was, a distant relative keeping a weather eye on a childless aunt's fortune, and she had, over the years, made a point of never discussing her actual finances with him in any detail, which she now believed, in retrospect, was precisely why he assumed there must be far more of it than there actually was, and precisely why, once word of the Voss Aerodynamics Legacy Trust reached him through a probate notice his own lawyer had flagged, he reacted the way he did. I found out about it the way most people find out about this kind of trouble now, which is a phone call from someone who had already read about it before I had any idea it existed. Priscilla Ahn called me on a Wednesday morning, her voice carrying a particular controlled tightness I hadn't heard from her in 6 weeks of meetings, and said, "Cole, I need you to sit down, and I need you to hear this from me before you hear a garbled version of it from anyone in town." And she told me that Grady Voss Pemberton had filed a petition in Vermont probate court requesting a formal capacity evaluation of Miriam Voss on the grounds, stated plainly in the filing, That a woman of 79 years, recently widowed of any remaining direct family connection, had begun making, in the petition's exact language, erratic and disproportionate financial decisions favoring a local handyman with no prior legal or fiduciary relationship to her, decisions that the petition suggested were consistent with either the early stages of cognitive decline or, in a phrase that landed like a physical blow when Priscilla read it to me over the phone, undue influence exerted by an opportunistic third party. I want to describe honestly what it felt like to hear those words applied to me, standing in my own garage with a wrench still in my hand from a job I'd stepped away from to take the call, my son's half-finished bicycle up on the stand behind me. 18 years of climbing a ladder for free, 18 years of never once asking that woman for anything, being folded in the space of a single legal filing written by a man who had visited her 4 times in 3 decades, into a story about a scheming tradesman who had somehow manipulated a vulnerable old widow out of her fortune. I had not asked Miriam Voss for $1 single. I had, if anything, spent 6 weeks trying to make the arrangement smaller rather than larger, and now there was a version of events sitting in a Vermont courthouse with my actual name in it, Cole Marsh, that painted me as something I had spent my entire adult life specifically deciding not to be. Renee found me still standing in the garage when she came out to see why I hadn't come in for dinner, and I watched her face go through the same journey mine had, shock, then a kind of protective fury I had genuinely never seen in 10 years of marriage. And she said, "Cole, this isn't right. We need to fight this properly." And I said, "Renee, I don't even know what fighting this looks like. We are not people with courtroom experience. We are a handyman and a part-time librarian. And the honest truth, in that moment, was that I did not know how you defend yourself against a story written by a man with a law firm on retainer and considerably more practice at this particular kind of fight than either of us had ever needed in our lives." I called Miriam that same evening, hands unsteady enough that I misdialed the number twice, and when she picked up, her voice sounded older than I had heard it since that very first day I'd climbed her ladder as a grieving 22-year-old, tired in a way that had nothing to do with her age and everything to do with a fight. She'd clearly been quietly anticipating for weeks without wanting to burden either of us with it before it broke into the open. She told me, and I believed every word of it, that Grady had never forgiven her, in some unspoken, low-simmering way that had never once been said directly, for the fact that Walter's side of the family had gotten so little of her attention, and he assumed so little of her eventual estate over the decades, and that he had apparently been waiting, patiently and at a considerable distance, for exactly this kind of triggering event, a large, specific, publicly filed transfer of wealth to someone outside the family to finally make the case he had clearly been rehearsing in his head for years. "Now," Miriam said, her voice breaking slightly in a way I had never once heard from her in 18 years, "now he has found the perfect vehicle for a resentment he has carried since Walter's funeral. And unfortunately, Cole, the vehicle is you, and I am so deeply sorry that decisions I made about my own family, decades before you were ever involved in any of this, have landed on your family's doorstep in the shape of a courthouse filing you did nothing to earn." The following weeks were the strangest of my life, stranger even than the afternoon I learned who she really was, because that afternoon had been surreal in a wondrous, vertiginous way, and this was surreal in a frightening one. Word travels fast in a town of 2,600 people, and within a week, nearly everyone in Ashworth Hollow had some version of the story, most of it garbled, some of it considerably worse than the truth. And I remember walking into the hardware store on Main Street to pick up flashing for a job and having the whole place go quiet for just a half second too long before old Warren Kettle, who has run that counter for 30 years, said, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "Cole Marsh, if anybody in here thinks you conned an old woman out of her roof money, they can say it to my face instead of whispering it in my store." And I nearly had to walk back out to my truck for a minute before I could trust my own voice not to break in front of half the town. Tucker came home from school one day and asked me, with the specific bluntness of an 8-year-old, if we were in trouble, because a kid in his class had said his dad stole money from a rich old lady, and I sat on the edge of his bed that night and had to explain, in words an 8-year-old could actually hold on to, that sometimes, when something good and unusual happens to ordinary people, other folks who don't understand it make up simpler, uglier stories than the truth, and that the truth, our truth, was that I had fixed Miriam's roof for free for a very long time because she needed help and I could give it, and that kindness is never something you should be ashamed of no matter what anyone says about it afterward. He seemed to accept that in the uncomplicated way children accept things when the parent they trust says them steadily enough, though I remember lying awake that whole night wishing I could believe my own words with quite that same uncomplicated steadiness. The formal capacity evaluation was scheduled for the second week of November, conducted by a court-appointed geriatric psychiatrist out of Burlington named Dr. Okonkwo Reyes, a calm, unhurried woman in her 50s who spent, by Miriam's later account, nearly 4 hours with her across 2 separate sessions, testing her memory, her reasoning, her understanding of financial concepts, her ability to explain clearly and consistently the reasoning behind every major decision in the trust documents. And I want to tell you that I spent those 2 weeks in a state of low-grade nausea I have not experienced since the week my father died, because for all my certainty about who Miriam actually was, some small, frightened corner of my mind kept circling the same terrible private question: what if the courts decide I'm wrong? What if a woman that sharp, that precise, that clearly still in command of her own considerable mind gets labeled incompetent anyway, simply because a judge finds the whole arrangement too unusual to credit? I want to describe the day Miriam asked me to come out to the farmhouse before her first session with Dr. Okonkwo Reyes, because it is one of the moments in this whole story I think about most. She was sitting at that same kitchen table, dressed more formally than I had ever seen her, and she looked at me with an expression that was, for the first time since she'd told me the truth about herself, something close to frightened. And she said, "Cole, I have spent 40 years being underestimated by people who assumed a woman couldn't possibly understand the mathematics in front of her, and I built an entire career on proving every one of them wrong. And now I am going to sit across from a stranger who has the legal authority to decide whether my own mind still belongs to me, based largely on whether she finds it credible that I chose to leave the bulk of my fortune to a roofer instead of a blood relative I've met 4 times in 30 years. And I find at 79 that I am considerably more frightened of that conversation than I ever was of watching an experimental descent vehicle carry my husband toward a runway. I did not know what to say to that, not really, except the truth, which was that I had watched her for 18 years hold a ladder steady with both hands in weather that would have sent a sensible person indoors, that I had watched her recite, from memory, technical specifications 40 years old without a single hesitation, that I had watched her explain orbital mechanics to my own wife with a patience and precision that had nothing whatsoever to do with confusion, and that if anyone in this county could walk into that evaluation and walk out of it more clearly, more convincingly herself than when she walked in, it was her. And she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Thank you, Cole. That is exactly the kind of plain, unglamorous confidence I did not know I needed to hear before walking into that room," which struck me, even in the middle of all that fear, as a very close echo of the exact sentence she'd said to me on a ladder 18 years earlier. "Your father would be proud of you, Cole," as though some part of both of us kept needing and finding precisely the right words at precisely the moment we most needed them. Dr. Okonkwo Reyes's written report, when it finally came back 3 weeks later, ran to 22 pages, and Priscilla Ahn read the key findings aloud to Renee and me over the phone in a voice that had, for the first time in this whole ordeal, an unmistakable note of relief in it. The report found Miriam Voss to possess, in its clinical language, full and unimpaired decision-making capacity, exceptional cognitive function for any age, let alone 79, And in a passage Priscilla read twice because she said she wanted us to hear it exactly as written, a reasoning process behind her estate planning that the evaluator described as unusually well organized, internally consistent across multiple independent interviews, and reflective of long-considered values rather than any recent or sudden change in judgment. The report noted, almost as an aside, that Miriam had been able to recall and explain, without prompting, the specific engineering rationale behind a landing gear revision she had proposed in 1983, including the load calculations, a level of sustained technical recall that the evaluator stated she had rarely encountered in a patient of any age. Grady Voss Pemberton's petition did not survive that report intact, and his lawyer, according to Priscilla, quietly began exploring a negotiated withdrawal within days of it being filed with the court. But I want to be honest that the resolution of the legal threat did not feel, in the moment, like the triumphant ending you might expect, because winning a capacity evaluation is not the same thing as healing a family. And Miriam, for all her relief, spent the better part of that week not celebrating, but grieving, quietly, in the specific way I had come to recognize in her, because whatever Grady's motives, he was the last living connection she had to Walter's side of the family, and losing even a distant transactional relationship to that connection felt, she told me, like closing a door she had kept slightly open for 42 years without ever quite admitting to herself that she'd been keeping it open at all. I want to tell you what happened next because I think it matters more than the legal victory itself, and because it is the part of this story I am proudest of, though I had almost nothing to do with it directly. Miriam asked Priscilla to reach out to Grady's lawyer, not to escalate anything further, but to propose something Priscilla told me she had never once seen a client request in a situation like this, which was a face-to-face meeting between Miriam and Grady, alone, without lawyers in the room, at the farmhouse, before any final paperwork closed the matter permanently. Grady agreed, reluctantly, according to his lawyer, mostly because refusing would have looked considerably worse than accepting, and he drove up from Hartford on a gray Saturday in early December, and I only know what happened in that meeting because Miriam told me about it afterward, sitting at that same kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, one of which, she noted with a small, tired smile, Grady had actually finished this time, unlike his previous 4 visits over 30 years, where he'd always left half of it behind along with most of his attention. She told him, she said, the whole story, not the version filtered through a legal filing, but the real one. Halcyon, Walter, the landing gear, the 18 years of watching a young man climb her roof for free and slowly becoming the person she trusted more than anyone else left in her life. And she told him, directly, that she understood why the timing and the size of the gift had looked, from 300 miles away and 4 visits in 30 years, like something suspicious rather than something considered. And she told him, and this part, she said, had cost her more than anything else in the whole conversation, that she was sorry, genuinely sorry, that she had never once, in 3 decades, made the effort to actually let him know her well enough that a filing like this would have seemed as absurd to him as it was to everyone who actually knew her. Grady, for his part, she said, had cried, actually cried, sitting at that kitchen table, and told her that some part of him had always resented that Walter's side of the family got so little of her time after the accident, not because he particularly wanted her money, though she suspected that was not entirely true either, but because he had spent his whole adult life feeling like the last living thread to his uncle had simply decided to disappear into a mountain town and never look back, and that watching a stranger, however decent, become the primary object of her trust and her legacy had reopened a wound about his own father's death that had never actually healed properly. They did not fully reconcile that day, Miriam told me, and I don't think either of them expected to. 30 years of distance doesn't dissolve over one difficult conversation, but they agreed to something smaller and, I think, considerably more honest, which was that Grady would receive a modest but genuinely meaningful bequest of his own, Not because the lawsuit had worked. Miriam was careful to specify that this had been decided before the meeting even happened, but because she realized, hearing him finally say the real reason behind his anger, that some of what he felt was fair, and that leaving him with absolutely nothing, while a handyman he'd never met inherited access to Walter's private papers, would have been its own kind of unkindness, one she hadn't fully reckoned with until she heard it in his own cracking voice. He withdrew the petition formally the following week, and Miriam told me, with the driest possible delivery, that Grady had called her twice since then, actual phone calls, not holiday obligations, which was, she said, more contact than she'd had with him in the previous decade combined, and she suspected, though she wouldn't say it with full confidence, that something real might yet grow out of the wreckage of that whole ugly month, slowly, the way most real things grow. I want to go back now and tell you about the barn, because I have mentioned it and moved past it too quickly, and it deserves its own proper telling, since it is where I finally understood, in a way no conversation at a kitchen table could have fully conveyed, exactly who Miriam Voss had been before Ashworth Hollow ever knew her name. She invited me out there on a cold, clear afternoon in late November, once the legal matter had settled, and unlocked a door I had walked past 100 times over 18 years without ever once being invited through. And inside, arranged with the same precision I'd always associated with her, but had never understood the scale of, were the steel filing cabinets I'd glimpsed the edge of years earlier, and a workbench cleaner and better organized than my own. And along one wall in acid-free boxes she'd clearly maintained with real care, 4 decades of technical drawings, correspondence, patent filings, and photographs that told the entire arc of a career most engineers only read about in textbooks. She showed me the original landing gear schematics for the Halcyon orbital return vehicle, hand-drafted in a draftsman's careful hand before the era of computer modeling, covered in her own handwritten calculations in the margins, revision after revision, each one dated, each one initialed by both her and Walter, because he had apparently reviewed every structural change from a pilot's practical perspective before it ever went to the fabrication shop, a detail that made the whole partnership between them suddenly, physically real to me in a way the story alone hadn't quite managed. She showed me a box of letters Walter had written her during the long stretches when test programs kept him away from home. Letters that were, she said with a small laugh, considerably more romantic than anyone who only knew him as a buttoned-down test pilot would have guessed. And she read me one line from one of them, out loud, her voice catching only slightly. Walter had written, "From a base in the Mojave in 1968, tell the fellows in structural I said the landing gear held just fine, and tell my wife I said the very same thing about coming home to her every single time," which is, I think, one of the most quietly beautiful sentences I have ever heard spoken out loud by anyone. And then she showed me the drawing that had haunted her for 42 years, the descent module strut revision she had proposed 6 weeks before Walter's accident, a drawing with a specific reinforcement detail circled twice in her own hand, and a memo beneath it, dated, addressed to a program director whose name meant nothing to me, explaining in clear, forceful engineering language exactly why the existing design carried an unacceptable margin of failure under certain thermal stress conditions. A memo that had been returned to her, she told me, with a single handwritten note across the top in someone else's hand, noted, cost prohibitive for current schedule, and 6 weeks later, Walter had died in exactly the failure mode she had specifically warned against. I asked her, as gently as I knew how, why she had kept that particular document for 4 decades instead of destroying it or simply putting it somewhere she'd never have to look at it again. And she said, "Cole, because the day I stop being able to look directly at the exact shape of my own worst grief is the day I start lying to myself about what actually happened. And I decided a very long time ago that I would rather carry the truth, however sharp, than carry a softer story I'd have to keep maintaining like a second false roof over the first one." I understood, standing in that barn, why she had chosen me, specifically, to see all of this, more clearly than I had understood it at her kitchen table weeks earlier, because she was not simply handing over documents, she was handing over the specific, unglamorous truth of a life, the failures included, the way I imagined she'd watched me handle every roof over 18 years, not simply patching the visible damage, but understanding and respecting the whole structure underneath it, water stains and all. I want to tell you about my mother's reaction to all of this, because it surprised me, and because I think it says something true about the specific kind of pride that runs through families like ours. I told Donna the whole story over Sunday dinner, expecting, if I'm honest, some version of worry, the same worry she'd voiced 18 years earlier about giving away free labor to everyone my father had liked. And instead, she sat very still for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and said, "Cole, your father used to say something to me about Miriam Voss that I never fully understood until just now. He said, 'Donna, that woman up on Larkspur Road watches everything I do, like she's grading it. And I can't tell if she likes me or if she's just making sure I don't cut a corner.' And I always told him, 'Russell, maybe it's both.' And apparently," my mother said, laughing in a way that had real tears mixed into it, "it really was both, for 40 years. And your father never once got to find out he passed, and I am so glad, Cole, that you did." My mother's hip, which had been slowly worsening again over the past year despite the replacement 4 years earlier, something about a secondary issue with the other hip that her doctor had been gently pushing her to address, became one of the first practical things the trade fund structure touched, not directly. Miriam was careful about that distinction. She did not want anyone in town to think the fund was simply a personal slush account for my family. But Priscilla Ahn helped us set up a small, entirely separate gift, structured properly and taxed properly, that covered the surgery and the specialized physical therapy that came after it. And I watched my mother walk without her cane for the first time in 3 years on a Tuesday morning in January, standing in her own kitchen, testing her weight on that hip like she didn't quite trust it yet. And she looked at me and said, "Cole, I cut hair in a mudroom for 40 years and never once thought I'd end up walking straight because of a rocket scientist's roof. And if that isn't the strangest sentence I've said in my whole life, I don't know what is." Renee's part in all of this deserves its own telling, too, because I think it's easy, in a story centered on me and Miriam, to lose track of the fact that Renee had her own relationship with Miriam long before I fully understood the size of who she was, built over years of library Wednesdays and quiet conversations about books neither of us had ever properly discussed with each other. Once the truth came out, Renee told me something that reframed those years for her the same way the barn had reframed them for me, which is that she'd always sensed there was something unusually precise about the way Miriam discussed physics and engineering, a fluency that went well beyond casual reading, but she'd never pushed because Miriam clearly wanted the library conversations to exist in their own separate, ordinary space, untouched by whatever the rest of her life had been. And Renee said she felt, in retrospect, a kind of quiet honor that Miriam had chosen to let those Wednesday mornings simply be about the books rather than about anything else, for as long as she needed them to be. Renee took on a role in the trade fund that neither of us expected at the start, largely because Priscilla Ahn pointed out, correctly, that the fund needed someone comfortable with paperwork, record-keeping, and the specific, patient work of matching applicants to opportunities, work that turned out to overlap almost perfectly with what Renee already did at the library 2 mornings a week. And by January, she had gone from volunteer shelver to the fund's part-time administrator, a genuine paid position that let her use, for the first time in years, the organizational instincts she'd always had, but never had much outlet for beyond the Dewey Decimal System and 2 small children's chaotic schedules. I want to say clearly that this was not a gift dressed up as a job. Renee interviewed for the position the same way anyone else would have. Priscilla insisted on that, precisely so that no one, including Renee herself, would ever wonder whether she'd earned it. And she did earn it, thoroughly, the way she earns everything, by simply being better at the actual work than anyone else who applied. Tucker's reaction to all of this deserves mention too, because it has become, in its own small way, One of my favorite threads in the whole story. After that first afternoon at Miriam's kitchen table, eating too many cookies and hearing the word aerospace for the first time in a context that actually meant something to him, Tucker became, almost overnight, obsessed in the specific total way an 8-year-old gets obsessed with everything Miriam had ever built. And Miriam, delighted, I think, in a way she hadn't expected to be, began inviting him out to the barn on Saturday mornings. Not the sealed archive of technical papers, but the workbench, where she started teaching him, slowly and with enormous patience, the basic principles of structural load, using popsicle sticks and glue, and eventually, small working models of the exact kind of hinge assembly she'd spent her career refining. Renee and I watched this unfold with a kind of quiet astonishment, because Tucker, who had never shown much patience for slow, careful work before, would sit at that workbench for 2 hours at a stretch, utterly absorbed. And Miriam told me once, watching him test a small model bridge to its actual breaking point with real scientific delight, rather than disappointment when it finally failed, Cole. I taught graduate engineers for 4 decades who had less natural instinct for structural failure than this child does, and I intend to make absolutely sure that instinct gets somewhere useful if his parents will allow it. Bertie, for her part, remained mostly unimpressed by rockets and far more interested in Miriam's actual physical presence, and had, by December, taken to calling her Aunt Miriam without anyone ever formally suggesting the title, simply arriving at it herself the way 5-year-olds arrive at the truth of relationships faster than adults usually do. And Miriam, when Bertie first used the word, standing in the farmhouse kitchen with cookie crumbs on her face, went very quiet for a moment and then said, very carefully, as though testing whether the word would hold her weight, "I suppose that's exactly right, isn't it?" And I watched something settle into her face in that moment that I don't think even the $290 million, or the trust structure, or the vindication of the capacity evaluation had quite managed to settle. The plain, unglamorous fact of being claimed by a family that wanted nothing from her except her actual company. I want to go back now and tell the story of the day Walter Voss died, as fully as Miriam ever told it to me, because I think you cannot understand the woman who eventually built the Voss Aerodynamics Legacy Trust without understanding the exact weight she has carried for 42 years. And because she asked me, specifically, when she finally told me the whole thing one evening in the barn, to tell it honestly if I ever told this story to anyone else, rather than softening it into something easier to hear. It was the 9th of September, 1983, a test of an experimental descent module at a facility in the high desert, a program running slightly behind schedule and slightly over budget, the kind of pressure that Miriam said, looking back, she recognized as dangerous even at the time and had not been forceful enough about, a judgment she has never fully forgiven herself for. She had submitted her structural revision 6 weeks earlier, flagging a specific thermal stress condition under which the proposed strut design could fail during a high-speed descent profile, a scenario her calculations showed was unlikely but not negligible. Somewhere in the range of 1 failure in several thousand descents, a number that sounds reassuring until you remember that Walter was going to be the one sitting inside the vehicle for this particular descent. Not a statistic spread across several thousand others. The revision was tabled, as I've told you, for cost and schedule reasons, by a program director who Miriam said was not a villain in this story, simply a man under his own pressure from above, making a judgment call that thousands of engineers before and after him have made under similar circumstances, most of the time without consequence, because most of the time the math simply holds. She told Walter about the tabled revision the night before the test. She said, because she has never in her life been able to keep something like that from him. And she remembers, with a clarity that has not dulled in 42 years, that he listened to the whole explanation carefully, the way he always listened to her technical explanations. And then he said, "Miri, if I refuse to fly every test that doesn't have your ideal margin built into it, I'll never fly anything. That's simply the nature of the work we chose, and I trust your math completely, which means I understand the odds are genuinely very good, and I am going to go to sleep now and fly this thing exactly the way I've flown 40 of them before it. The failure occurred during the descent's final phase, precisely in the thermal stress window Miriam had flagged, precisely in the mode her memo had described 6 weeks earlier, and Walter Voss died in the resulting structural failure. And Miriam told me that the single hardest professional moment of her entire career was sitting in a review board meeting 2 weeks later, presenting the failure analysis herself, because no one else at Halcyon had the technical standing to do it properly, and having to walk a room full of her own colleagues through the exact chain of decisions that had killed her own husband, using her own handwriting on the original memo as Exhibit A, and finishing the presentation, dry-eyed, professional, because she said she understood even then that if she broke down in that room, the men in it would spend the next decade quietly deciding that women were too emotional to be trusted with structural authority, and she was not going to hand them that satisfaction on top of everything else grief had already taken from her that month. I asked her, in the barn that evening, how she had managed to keep working at Halcyon for 11 more years after that, in the same building, under some of the same leadership, and she said, "Cole, I stayed because leaving would have meant admitting that the work itself was the problem, and the work was never the problem. The specific cost-cutting decision was the problem, and I decided that the only meaningful response to Walter's death was to make myself so undeniably necessary to that company's structural integrity that no future program director would ever again feel comfortable tabling a safety revision without an extremely uncomfortable conversation with me first, and by the time I left in 1994, she told me with a small, hard pride I understood completely. No descent module at Halcyon Aerodynamics had shipped with an unresolved structural flag in over a decade, not because the company had grown more virtuous, but because she had made herself the kind of engineer whose flags simply could not be quietly set aside anymore. I think about that story every time I climb a ladder now, which I know sounds like a strange place for my mind to go, but there is something in it that has changed the way I do my own work, a specific new seriousness about the difference between patching what's visible and actually solving what's underneath it. And I told Miriam that once, and she said, "Cole, that is precisely why I trusted you with all of this before I trusted anyone else, because you have always understood, on a much smaller scale, exactly the same principle it took me a dead husband to fully learn, which is that the corner you cut to save time or money today is the corner somebody else pays for later, often at a cost you can't undo." I want to tell you now about the town hall meeting, because it is the closest thing this story has to the kind of public moment you might expect from something this size, though it did not unfold the way I imagine either of us pictured it beforehand. The Voss Aerodynamics Legacy Trust was formally announced in late January at a meeting in the Ashworth Hollow Grange Hall that Miriam insisted on attending in person, despite 30 years of avoiding exactly this kind of public visibility, because she said plainly, "If I am going to ask this town to send its children through a scholarship program with my name attached to it, the least I owe this town is showing up in the room to say so myself." The Grange Hall seats about 200 people, and it was full that night, folding chairs added along the back wall, because word had traveled, in the accurate version this time, that something significant was being announced, though most of the town still didn't know the full shape of it. Mayor Aldous Pruitt, a soft-spoken man who has run the town's business for 11 years and coaches Tucker's youth baseball team on the side, introduced Miriam with visible nerves of his own, clearly aware he was introducing a woman whose actual biography he had only learned in full a week earlier. And when Miriam stood up at that podium, 79 years old in a plain gray cardigan, and told the assembled town, in the same clear, unhurried voice she'd used at her own kitchen table, the story of Halcyon Aerodynamics and the landing gear, and Walter and the 18 years of a young man's roof, repairs that had convinced her Ashworth Hollow was exactly the kind of place worth investing in. I watched the room go through the same journey I had gone through months earlier in her kitchen, shock sliding into disbelief, sliding into something that, by the end of her remarks, had become a kind of collective, stunned pride. The specific pride a small town feels when it learns one of its own quiet, overlooked residents was extraordinary all along and simply never said so. She announced the scholarship fund for engineering students from underserved districts and the separate trade fund for young plumbers and electricians and carpenters and roofers. Administered, she said, looking directly at me in the third row where I sat with Renee and both kids, by a man who has never once, in 18 years, sent her an invoice for work she desperately needed done. And I watched 300 faces turn toward me at once. And I want to be honest that it was one of the more mortifying 30 seconds of my entire life, though Renee squeezed my hand hard enough that I understood I was allowed to be proud of it too, rather than simply embarrassed. I want to describe specific faces in that room because they've stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that night. I saw Curtis Halloway, a 19-year-old who'd been working at his uncle's auto shop for 2 years, unable to afford the diesel mechanic certificate that would have doubled his eventual wage, sitting with his mother, and I watched him go completely still when Miriam described the trade fund's scope, the specific way a person goes still when they realize an opportunity they'd stopped letting themselves hope for has just become real. I saw Mrs. Okafor, who taught shop class at the regional high school for 22 years before budget cuts eliminated the program 4 years ago, sitting near the back, and I saw her put a hand to her mouth when Miriam mentioned partnering with the high school to reintroduce a properly funded technical education track, because Mrs. Okafor had spent 4 years watching kids who would have thrived with their hands instead get funneled into academic tracks that didn't fit them, with no alternative offered. And I saw Warren Kettle from the hardware store, arms crossed, jaw tight, the specific posture of a man trying very hard not to cry in public because Warren's own son had left Ashworth Hollow for a trade school 2 states away, specifically because nothing like this had existed here when he needed it. And Warren told me afterward, gripping my hand at the door, if this had existed 8 years ago, Cole, my boy might still be close enough to visit on a Sunday. Afterward, in the Grange Hall parking lot under sodium lights that turn everyone's coat the same shade of orange, dozens of people came up to me, some who'd known me my whole life, some I barely recognized, asking questions I answered as honestly as I could without overstepping what wasn't entirely mine to share. And I remember an older man, a stranger to me actually, gripping my forearm and saying, "My granddaughter's been paying off trade school loans for 6 years on a hairdresser's wages doing electrical work she loves and can barely afford to keep doing. Tell me this is real." And I told him, "It's real, sir. I promise you it's real." And watching his face when he heard that, watching hope arrive somewhere it had clearly been carefully rationed for a long time, is a memory I suspect I will carry with the same clarity 20 years from now that I carry the memory of the very first rainy morning I climbed Miriam's ladder as a grieving 22-year-old. Some moments simply attach themselves to you permanently, and you don't get to choose in advance which ones those will be. You just recognize them afterward by how often you find yourself returning to stand inside them again. I wish I could tell you the story ends there at the Grange Hall, with the applause and the mayor's nervous introduction and Renee's hand tight around mine, but it doesn't. And I promised myself when I decided to tell this story that I would tell all of it, including the 4 weeks that followed, which were, in their own particular way, nearly as difficult as the capacity evaluation had been, because a story this size does not stay contained inside a town of 2,600 people for very long, not anymore. Not in an age when anyone with a phone can turn a Grange Hall announcement into a national headline within 48 hours. It started small, a regional business paper out of Burlington running a piece about the trust, accurate and fairly respectful. And then, within a week, a much larger financial news outlet picked it up with a headline considerably less careful than the original piece. Something along the lines of "Reclusive Aerospace Pioneer's Fortune Goes to Vermont. Handyman instead of family," a headline that managed, in 8 words, to strip out every piece of context that actually mattered. The 18 years, the free roof repairs, the scholarship fund for kids who'd never otherwise get the chance, the failed capacity evaluation against Grady, and reduce the whole thing to precisely the suspicious, simplified shape Grady's original petition had tried and failed to prove in court. Within days, a news van from a station out of Manchester actually parked at the end of Larkspur Road, and a second one showed up outside my own shop on Cobble Hill Road. And I want to describe honestly what that felt like, because it was a different, more diffuse kind of fear than the courthouse filing had been. Less a single-named enemy and more a wide, faceless pressure. Strangers calling my shop phone asking for interviews, a comment thread under one article that I made the mistake of reading once, full of people who had never met either of us confidently explaining exactly how I had manipulated a lonely old woman, using words considerably uglier than anything Grady's lawyer had ever put in an actual legal filing. Tucker came home from school again, this time reporting that a kid had asked him if his family was rich now. "Are you rich now?" in a tone Tucker described, with unusual precision for an 8-year-old, as more like an accusation than a question. And Bertie, sensing the tension in the house without understanding its source, started asking, every evening for the better part of a week, if Aunt Miriam was going to have to move away because of the news people. Miriam herself handled it, I think, with more grace than either Renee or I initially could, largely because she had, in some sense, already lived through a smaller version of exactly this kind of scrutiny decades earlier, during her years at Halcyon, when being one of the only women in a room of powerful men had taught her, young, exactly how quickly a stranger's narrative could get built around you without your consent. She called me on the third day of the news vans and said, "Cole, I want you to understand something I learned a very long time ago and hoped I would never need to teach anyone else, which is that you cannot out-argue a bad headline. You can only outlast it. And the way you outlast it is by refusing to let it change the actual shape of your life underneath it." And she told me she intended to keep doing exactly what she had always done. Her Wednesday grocery run, her library visits, Tucker's Saturday mornings in the barn, and that the single most powerful thing either of us could do was simply continue being who we actually were until the story got boring enough that the vans found something else to chase. What actually ended it, though, faster than either of us expected, was the town itself, in a way that I think says more about Ashworth Hollow than anything I could describe directly. Warren Kettle, the same hardware store owner who defended me the week the courthouse filing became public, walked out to the news van parked outside my shop on the fourth morning, and, according to Curtis, who watched the whole thing from across the street, informed the reporter standing beside it that if she wanted an actual interview, she was welcome to come inside the hardware store and talk to the 11 people currently in line to apply for the new trade fund. Real people with real names who could tell her exactly what 18 years of free roof repairs and one quiet aerospace engineer's decision to invest in her own town actually looked like from the inside, rather than standing in a parking lot speculating about motives to a camera. The reporter, to her credit, actually took him up on it, and the piece that ran 2 days later looked almost nothing like the first one, led with Curtis's own story, the diesel mechanic certificate he could finally afford, and Mrs. Okafor's shop class returning to the high school curriculum by the following autumn. And by the time that second, more honest piece circulated, the ugly comment threads under the first one had mostly gone quiet, buried under a wave of considerably kinder ones, and within another week the news vans had found some other story to chase, the way Miriam had promised they eventually would. I want to tell you about the specific morning I understood we had actually come out the other side of all of it, because it wasn't a dramatic moment, it was almost aggressively ordinary, which I've come to believe is exactly what recovering from something like this actually looks like. It was a Tuesday in February, deep winter, and I drove out to Larkspur Road for no particular reason, just to check on Miriam the way I'd started doing once a week regardless of the roof, and I found her in the barn with Tucker. The two of them bent over a small model truss bridge, and Miriam was saying, in that same clear, unhurried teaching voice, "No, Tucker, look again. Where exactly is the load concentrating when you press down there?" And Tucker, tongue between his teeth in total concentration, said, "Right here, by the joint." And Miriam said, "Precisely." And that's exactly the kind of joint that killed my husband, so you're going to learn to spot it before it ever gets built wrong in the first place. And I stood in that barn doorway for a long moment, unnoticed by either of them, and understood that whatever the trust would eventually accomplish on paper, this, an 8-year-old learning to see structural failure before it happens from the one woman in the world most qualified to teach him, was already worth every single difficult week it had taken to get here. The trade fund's first full year produced results that still, honestly, catch me off guard when I think about them all at once. Curtis Halloway got his diesel certificate, and 6 months later, the promotion at his uncle's shop he'd been quietly hoping for long enough to finally propose to his girlfriend. A fact I only learned because Miriam insisted on being invited to the small engagement party, where she gave a toast so dry and so unexpectedly moving that half the room needed napkins by the end of it. 4 sentences total, the last one being, "Curtis, may your joints always be properly reinforced." In every sense of that phrase, which nobody but me and Renee fully understood, and which made us laugh so hard we had to step outside. Mrs. Okafor's shop class reopened at the regional high school that fall with a fully equipped workshop, funded jointly by the trust and a matching grant the state offered once it became clear Ashworth Hollow was serious about the program, and by the following spring she had 18 students enrolled. 3 times what she'd had in her final year before the original program was cut. The engineering scholarship side of the trust moved more slowly, the way large academic commitments tend to, but by early summer the first cohort had been selected, 7 students total, drawn from small overlooked school districts across 3 states, districts Priscilla On's team had specifically identified using the same criteria Miriam had insisted on from the beginning. Strong students with real aptitude who lacked the resources or the institutional connections that a wealthier district would have handed them without a second thought. Miriam insisted on personally reviewing every application in that first cohort, staying up later than Renee or I thought was good for a woman her age, and she told me once, halfway through that process, that reading a 16-year-old girl's essay about designing her own wind turbine out of scrap parts from her father's junkyard had made her cry at her own kitchen table in a way that 40 years of Halcyon board meetings never once had, because, she said, that is exactly the kind of engineer this fund exists to find, the ones nobody with a spreadsheet would ever think to look for. I want to tell you about Miriam's 80th birthday, which fell in June, because it is one of the warmest memories I have from this entire year, and because I think it shows better than anything else how completely she had, in the space of about 8 months, gone from the town's quiet, slightly mysterious widow to something considerably closer to a beloved fixture. Renee organized it with help from half the town, and Miriam, who I fully expected to resist any kind of public celebration given everything she'd been through with the press only months earlier, surprised us by agreeing readily, saying only, "Renee, I have spent 8 months being extremely visible against my own preferences. I suppose one afternoon of cake won't kill me, and it might as well be a cake I actually enjoy." The party was held at the Grange Hall, the same room where the trust had been announced, and this time there wasn't a single reporter in the building, just close to 150 people from Ashworth Hollow who had, in one way or another, been touched by what Miriam had built. Curtis and his now fiancée, Mrs. Okafor, and a half dozen of her new shop students, my mother walking without her cane, Warren Kettle, Mayor Pruitt, and dozens of families I recognized only vaguely, but who all seemed to have some small connection to the fund by then. Tucker gave a short, deeply earnest speech about structural load-bearing that ran considerably longer than an 8-year-old's speech has any right to run. And Bertie insisted on singing Happy Birthday twice because she felt the first rendition, sung by the whole room, hadn't been quite good enough, and Miriam laughed until she had to wipe her eyes and told me afterward, quietly, while the party moved on around us, "Cole, I spent 30 years in this town making absolutely certain nobody knew who I really was, and I find, at 80, that being fully known by the people around me feels considerably better than I ever let myself imagine it could. I have to tell you about the scare we had in late July, because it is the part of this story that reminded all of us, sharply, exactly, how much had changed and exactly how much had not. And because I think leaving it out would make this sound like a story where the hardest part was always the money and the lawsuits, when in fact the hardest part for a few days that summer was simply the plain universal fear of nearly losing someone you love. Miriam collapsed in her own kitchen on a Thursday morning alone and was only found because Renee, who had started stopping by on her way to the library on days Miriam didn't call ahead to cancel their standing coffee, arrived 20 minutes later than usual and found her on the floor, conscious but disoriented, unable to fully explain what had happened. It turned out to be a cardiac event, not catastrophic. The doctors at the regional hospital told us once she'd stabilized, but serious enough that she spent 4 days in the cardiac unit and would need a procedure the following month to address a blockage they'd found. And I want to describe honestly what those 4 days felt like, because they were, without question, harder than the lawsuit and harder than the news vans combined, in the specific way that watching someone you love lie in a hospital bed is always harder than any conflict involving paperwork. I sat in that hospital room more hours than I probably should have, given I still had a business to run and 2 kids at home, and Renee took over both, ferrying Tucker and Bertie back and forth, running the trade fund's daily operations from a laptop propped on a hospital cafeteria table, and somewhere in the second night, sitting beside Miriam's bed while she slept, machines beeping steadily beside her, I thought about the fact that 18 years earlier I had climbed a ladder for this woman on the day I buried my own father, and that some circle in my life seemed to be closing, slowly, around the plain, unglamorous truth that showing up for people is not a single grand gesture. It is 1,000 small returns to the same hospital chair, the same ladder, the same kitchen table, for as long as it takes. Miriam woke on the second morning, groggy but entirely herself, sharp-eyed even through the haze of whatever they had her on, and the first thing she said, looking at me sitting beside her bed, was, "Cole, did anyone remember to feed the barn cat?" Which made me laugh so hard a nurse came to check on me, because of course there is a barn cat, a scrappy orange Tom Miriam had never officially adopted but had been feeding for 6 years regardless. And of course, that was the very first thing on her mind. Not the blockage, not the procedure, the cat. And I told her yes, Tucker had already gone out that morning before school specifically to handle it. And something in her face relaxed in a way that told me, more than any medical report could have, that she was going to be all right. She had the procedure in August, successful, and spent 6 weeks recovering with a home health aide the trust itself paid for. An arrangement she initially resisted with real stubbornness, telling Priscilla on flatly that she had managed alone for 30 years and did not require supervision now, until Renee sat her down and said, with the specific bluntness Renee reserves for people she loves most, "Miriam, you are allowed to accept help without it meaning you've lost anything. You spent 40 years teaching engineers that redundancy in a system isn't weakness. It's what keeps the whole structure from failing when one part gives out. So let the home health aide be your redundancy, and stop pretending you have to be the only load-bearing wall in this house," which Miriam repeated back to me for weeks afterward with visible delight, telling anyone who'd listen that her niece by marriage, because that was the word she used by then, without hesitation, had finally out-argued her, using her own engineering principles against her. Grady drove up from Hartford twice during her recovery, actual visits, longer than the holiday obligation stops of years past, and on the second visit he brought his own 2 teenage children, cousins of a sort Miriam had never had any relationship with at all, and I watched, from a careful distance, something genuinely new begin to take root in that family, not a full repair of 40 years of distance. That kind of thing doesn't happen in a single summer, but a real, deliberate effort on both sides that hadn't existed before any of this started. And Miriam told me once in September that she had begun including Grady's children, alongside Tucker, in occasional Saturday mornings at the barn, teaching them the same basic principles of structural load she'd been teaching my son. And she said, "Cole, I spent 30 years assuming Walter's family, and I had simply grown apart beyond repair. And it turns out what we'd actually done was simply stop showing up for each other. which is a very different problem and a very repairable one, if both sides are finally willing to try. I want to tell one more story from that first year about a scholarship recipient named Alondra Reyes, because I think it captures something about the trust's actual purpose better than any of the numbers or the ceremonies ever could. Alondra was 16 when she applied, living with her grandmother in a former mill town in New Hampshire, a district so underfunded that her high school had eliminated its only advanced physics course 2 years before she would have taken it, forcing her to teach herself the material from library books and free online lectures on a second-hand laptop with a cracked screen. The exact kind of resourcefulness Miriam said she recognized instantly, because it was, in its own way, a smaller echo of her own childhood, a machinist's daughter reading blueprints before she was 10. Alondra's application essay described, in careful, precise detail, a bridge she had built out of scrap lumber behind her grandmother's house. Not for a school project. No such project existed anymore at her school, but simply because she wanted to test a theory she'd read about regarding truss geometry, and she had photographed the whole process and included the photographs with her application, along with a full accounting of exactly where her calculations had been wrong the first 2 times and how she'd corrected them. Miriam read that essay twice, she told me, and then called Priscilla on directly, unusual for her, normally content to let the selection committee do its work, and said, "This one, whatever else happens with the rest of the cohort, this one gets a scholarship." Because I have not seen instincts like this in an applicant since I interviewed my own hiring class at Halcyon in 1964, and half of them had considerably more formal training than this girl has ever had access to. I met Alondra myself in the spring when Miriam invited her and her grandmother up to Ashworth Hollow for a weekend, partly to tour the barn and partly, I think, because Miriam recognized something in the girl's situation that made her want to offer more than a check mailed through a foundation's administrative office. Alondra's grandmother, a soft-spoken woman named Consuela, who had raised her alone since Alondra's mother passed when the girl was 7, cried in Miriam's kitchen, actual tears, when Miriam explained that the scholarship covered not just tuition, but housing, books, and a laptop that actually worked, and said, in halting English, she apologized for unnecessarily, "Dr. Voss, I have been so afraid for so long that being smart in the wrong zip code would simply be the end of the story for her." And Miriam took the older woman's hands in both of hers, a gesture I had genuinely never once seen her make with anyone in 18 years, and said, "Consuela, I built landing systems that carried men safely out of the sky. And none of that work has ever felt as important to me as making absolutely certain that being smart in the wrong zip code stops being the end of anyone's story, starting with your granddaughter." Alondra spent that whole weekend in the barn with Miriam and Tucker, and I watched Miriam explain load calculations to a 16-year-old with the exact same patient, unhurried precision she used with my 9-year-old, adjusting the complexity of the explanation without ever once condescending to either of them. And at one point, Alondra asked a question about thermal stress tolerances that made Miriam go quiet for a long moment, studying the girl with an expression I recognized, because it was the same expression she'd once turned on me at her kitchen table, the look of someone recalculating exactly how much they were dealing with. And Miriam finally said, "Alondra, that is precisely the question that killed my husband, and precisely the question nobody thought to ask loudly enough 42 years ago. And I want you to understand, sitting in this barn today, that the fact you asked it, unprompted at 16 years old, tells me everything I need to know about the kind of engineer this world is about to gain." Alondra started her engineering program that fall on a full scholarship, and she calls Miriam most Sunday evenings, an actual standing phone call the two of them have kept without missing a single week. And Miriam told me, with more open pride than I'd ever heard her allow herself before all of this started, that listening to Alondra work through her first-year coursework over the phone, hearing a 16-year-old, now 17, wrestle honestly and rigorously with the same kind of problems Miriam spent 40 years solving, felt like watching a door open that she had genuinely believed, for most of her adult life, was going to stay closed behind her forever once she left Halcyon. By the time this past October rolled around again, a full year after Miriam first sat me down at her kitchen table and told me the truth, I found myself thinking often about how much had changed and how much, underneath all of it, had stayed exactly the same. I still climb ladders for a living. I still, if I'm honest, feel a small flare of the old nervous habit every single time a storm rolls in over the Green Mountains. Some part of me still checking, instinctively, whether Miriam's roof needs attention, even though the roof itself had been fully replaced that spring, a proper job done not for free this time, but paid in full, because Miriam had insisted, once the trust was established, that the free repair arrangement finally come to a formal, dignified close, telling me, with her usual dry precision, Cole, the entire point of the last 18 years was never that the labor should stay free forever. It was that it should be freely given until it no longer needed to be. And we have now very clearly arrived at no longer needed to be. So let me pay you properly for once in your life, and stop looking at me like I've insulted you. My business itself had changed shape considerably over that year, too, in ways I hadn't fully anticipated when all of this started. Word of the trade fund brought me into contact with young people all over the county in a way my solo handyman practice never had before. Kids applying for scholarships who needed an actual mentor to shadow, not just a name on a foundation letterhead. And by that October, I had, almost without deciding to formally, taken on my first 2 apprentices, a 19-year-old named Wesley Doiron, who'd grown up 2 towns over with even less than I'd had at his age, and a 20-year-old woman named Priya Anand, the first woman to ever apply to the Trade Fund's apprenticeship track, who told me on her first day that she'd wanted to work with her hands since she was 12 years old and had simply never met anyone willing to take the chance on training her properly. And I thought, watching her set up a ladder with the same careful, deliberate attention I remembered from myself at 19, that some version of what Miriam had once done for me, without either of us fully realizing it at the time, was quietly repeating itself, one ladder at a time, in exactly the way she'd always hoped it would. I want to tell you about Wesley specifically, because his story has become, for me, one of the clearest proofs of what this whole trust actually exists to do. Wesley's father had left the family when Wesley was 11, and his mother worked 2 jobs to keep their trailer on a rented lot. And by the time he turned 18, he'd already been told more than once by well-meaning school counselors that college wasn't realistic for him, and neither, frankly, was much of anything beyond whatever entry-level work he could find locally. A message he had, by his own account, mostly come to believe about himself. The trade fund paid for his full apprenticeship certification and his tools, real tools, not the second-hand, half-broken set he'd been cobbling together on his own. And by that October, he had passed his first licensing exam and was talking, with a kind of quiet confidence I recognized immediately because I'd worn it myself once, about someday running his own crew. He told me once, working alongside me on a job replacing storm windows for an elderly widower on the other side of town, Cole, nobody in my whole life ever told me I was actually good at something until this fund gave somebody a reason to look closely enough to notice, and I had to step around the side of the house for a minute after he said that, because 18 years of climbing Miriam's ladder had led, through a chain of events neither of us could have predicted, to exactly this sentence, spoken by a kid who badly needed to hear it. I want to describe the specific afternoon last month when Miriam asked me to drive her out to the old Halcyon Aerodynamics facility, now owned by a different company entirely, on a trip she said she'd been putting off for nearly 30 years and finally felt ready to take. It was a 6-hour drive, and we did it together, just the 2 of us, Renee watching the kids, and I want to tell you honestly that I did not fully understand, setting out that morning, how much that drive would end up meaning to me. We didn't talk much for the first 2 hours, comfortable silence, the kind 18 years of storm seasons together had built between us long before either of us knew the full shape of who the other person was. And then, somewhere past the state line, She started talking, unprompted, about Walter, about the early years of the marriage, about specific small memories she said she had never told anyone, not even me in all our previous conversations. Small, ordinary things, the way he hummed off-key while shaving, the terrible jokes he told at dinner parties that made her wince and laugh in the same instant, the specific weight of his hand on the back of her neck when she was working through a difficult calculation late at night. And I understood, listening to her, that this drive was not really about the facility at all. It was about finally being ready to let someone else carry a small piece of Walter's memory alongside her, rather than holding the entire weight of it alone in a barn at the end of a dirt road for 42 years. We stood outside the facility's gate together, unable to go inside since it belonged to someone else entirely now, and Miriam looked at the building for a long time and said, finally, "Cole, I built the safest landing system of its generation in that building, and it still wasn't safe enough for the one person I most needed to keep safe, and I have spent 42 years believing that meant I had somehow failed at the thing I was best at in the entire world." And then she was quiet for a moment and said, "But I think, standing here now, that I finally understand the actual lesson underneath all of it, which is that you cannot engineer away every risk in a life worth living. You can only make absolutely certain that the people around you know, without question, that you gave the work everything you had, and that the love underneath the work was always real. And I think, Cole, watching you climb that ladder for 18 years expecting nothing back is what finally taught me how to believe that about my own life too. I want to tell you about one more conversation from that drive home, because it has stayed with me more than almost anything else in this whole story, and because I think it gets closest to the actual heart of what I've been trying to describe this entire time. Somewhere in the last hour of the drive, with the Green Mountains finally rising up ahead of us again, familiar and low and welcoming after a day spent somewhere flatter and stranger, Miriam asked me, out of nowhere, whether I had ever regretted, even once in 18 years, all those unpaid Saturdays, all those storms I drove out into instead of staying home with my own young family. And I thought about it seriously, because she deserved a serious answer rather than a reflexive one. And I told her the truth, which is that there were mornings, especially in the hard years, especially that one spring when Tucker was sick and the propane bill was overdue, when some tired human part of me resented the arrangement, briefly, privately, before the better part of me overruled it. And I told her I didn't think that made the kindness less real. I thought it made it more real, because the version of kindness that costs you nothing isn't really a decision at all. It's just a preference, and the version that costs you something and you choose it anyway, over and over, storm after storm. That's the only kind that actually means what people think it means when they use the word. She was quiet for a long moment after I said that, watching the mountains get closer, and then she said, "Cole, I spent 4 decades designing systems that had to survive catastrophic, sudden failure, thermal stress, structural fatigue, the specific violent moment when something built to hold simply stops holding. And I understand that kind of engineering better than almost anyone alive. But I did not understand, until I met you and your family, the considerably harder engineering problem of building something that survives 18 years of quiet, unglamorous, unrewarded maintenance. The kind of structural integrity that isn't tested in one dramatic failure, but in 10,000 small mornings where nobody is watching and nobody would ever know if you simply decided not to show up. That is a kind of engineering I never learned to do myself. Not really. Not until I was nearly 80 years old and had the extraordinary luck to watch someone else do it for free, out of my own tip jar, so to speak, for the better part of 2 decades. I want to tell you about one final conversation, this one with Priscilla because I think it offers a useful outside perspective on everything I've described. From someone who watched this whole story unfold with the specific professional distance of a lawyer who has seen a great many estates settled, most of them far less gracefully than this one. I asked her once, near the end of that first year, over coffee at her office in Boston, where I'd gone to sign some final paperwork on the trust's second-year budget, whether she had seen many arrangements like this one in her career, a fortune this size going to someone entirely outside the family, and she considered the question carefully before answering, the way I'd come to recognize as her particular habit, and said, "Cole, I have handled perhaps a dozen estates of this general size in 22 years of practice, and I want to be honest with you. Most of them do not go well, not because the money is spent poorly, but because the underlying relationship the gift was meant to honor was never actually as solid as the client believed it was. And the money, once it arrives, has a way of exposing every crack that was already quietly there. What I watched happen between you and Miriam Voss was different, and I want you to understand why, professionally, because I don't think you fully see it from the inside the way I saw it from mine." She said, "The single detail that told me this was going to hold more than any other single fact in the file was the fear list you and Renee wrote before you ever called Miriam back with an answer. I have represented dozens of beneficiaries over the years who came to that first meeting with a want list already fully formed and no fear list at all. And every single one of those relationships eventually fractured under the weight of expectations nobody had bothered to examine honestly before the money arrived. You and your wife did the examining first, unprompted, before anyone even asked you to, and that is not a common instinct, Cole. That is closer to what I'd call structural discipline. The same discipline, frankly, that made Miriam trust you with a roof for 18 years in the first place. I told Priscilla that I hadn't thought of it in those terms before, that it had simply felt like the only honest way to have the conversation. And she said, "That's precisely my point. It wasn't a strategy for either of you. It was simply who you already were. And that is exactly why it worked as well as it has." I asked her, before we finished that conversation, what she thought would happen to the trust over the next decade, whether something this new and this personally structured could actually survive the ordinary entropy that eventually touches every large institution. And she said, with the same careful precision Miriam herself might have used, "I think the trust survives exactly as long as the people running it remember that its entire purpose was never the money itself. It was the specific patient attention Miriam paid to who actually deserved it. And if you and Renee keep insisting on reading every application as carefully as she read Alondra Reyes's essay about a scrap lumber bridge, this fund will still be changing lives in this county long after every one of us currently involved in it is gone." Which is, I think, precisely the kind of legacy Dr. Voss set out to build from the very beginning, whether she fully knew it at the start or not. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me, and I want to leave it with you, because I think it is the actual center of this whole story, more than the money, more than the lawsuit, more than the $290 million, or the trust, or even the reconciliation with Grady, which continues to grow slowly and genuinely with each passing month. The center of this story is the plain, unglamorous, decidedly unremarkable fact that showing up for someone, again and again, with no expectation of anything in return, is not a small thing dressed up to look important after the fact. It is, in fact, the largest thing most of us will ever build in our entire lives. Larger, in its own way, than any landing gear system or any nine-figure trust. Because it is the only kind of structure that holds up a whole town, quietly, invisibly, for as long as enough people keep choosing, storm after storm, to be the ones who show up. I want to close this out by telling you where everyone stands now, because I think endings matter, and because I think you deserve to know that this story, unlike so many stories about sudden fortune, actually settled into something sustainable, rather than simply spectacular. The Voss Aerodynamics Legacy Trust enters its second full year this coming spring with an expanded cohort, 14 engineering scholarships instead of 7, and a trade fund that has now fully certified 11 young tradespeople across 3 counties, with Wesley Doiron and Priya Anand both on track to become certified journeymen within the year, and both of them, I should say, already talking about which younger kid in their own hometowns they intend to mentor once they're established enough to do it, which is exactly the kind of quiet multiplication Miriam always said she was hoping for and never quite dared to promise out loud. Mrs. Okafor's shop program at the regional high school now has a waiting list, an actual waiting list, for the first time in the history of that school's technical education department. And the State Education Board has apparently begun using Ashworth Hollow as a case study for other small districts considering similar investments, a fact that Mrs. Okafor told me with real satisfaction. She intends to keep reminding the state board of every single time they consider cutting funding for programs like hers anywhere else in Vermont. My mother walks without her cane most days now and has taken up at the specific suggestion of Miriam, who apparently will not let anyone in this story simply rest on their laurels, a part-time position teaching a basic home repair and small appliance course through the Trade Fund's community outreach arm, aimed specifically at older residents living alone who can't always afford or access a professional handyman for the small stuff. A program my mother named, over my strenuous objections, Donna's Fix-It Hour, which has become somehow one of the most popular offerings the fund runs, packed every single Tuesday morning with retirees learning to replace a washer or rewire a lamp themselves. Renee continues running the Trade Fund's daily operations and has, over this past year, developed a genuine expertise in matching young applicants to the right mentors and the right opportunities that I think even she didn't fully anticipate she had in her. And she told me recently, with the specific quiet satisfaction I recognize from watching her organize anything, that she has finally found work that uses every single part of her, the way raising 2 kids and volunteering at a library, wonderful as both of those things are, never quite managed to on their own. Tucker, now 9, has moved on from popsicle stick bridges to an actual functioning scale model of a suspension bridge that took him and Miriam the better part of 3 months to design and build together. And he has already announced, with the total unshakable confidence of a 9-year-old, that he intends to become a structural engineer exactly like Aunt Miriam, a plan Miriam has neither encouraged nor discouraged directly, telling him only, with her usual dry precision, that she will be considerably more impressed once he can explain why a suspension bridge actually works rather than simply that it does, which has sent him back to the workbench with even more determination than before. Bertie, 6 now, remains steadfastly uninterested in structural engineering and has instead adopted the barn cat as her own, officially this time, with Miriam's full blessing, naming him Colonel Whiskers, for reasons no adult in this story has ever fully understood, and spends her Saturday mornings at the farmhouse mostly supervising the cat rather than the bridge building, which Miriam says she finds equally valuable work. Grady Voss Pemberton drove up from Hartford again just last month, this time bringing both his teenage children for a full weekend rather than a single afternoon. And Miriam told me afterward, with an unmistakable warmth she still delivers in the driest possible tone, that his daughter, 16 and apparently every bit as sharp as Miriam herself once was, had spent the entire weekend in the barn asking increasingly sophisticated questions about the original landing gear schematics, and that Miriam had come away from the weekend with the strong, quiet suspicion that Walter's family line might yet produce its own engineer after all, 40 years later than she ever expected to see it happen, and considerably more grateful for the possibility than she ever imagined she would be. As for Miriam herself, she is, as of this telling, 80 years old, fully recovered from the cardiac procedure, sharper than most people I know of any age, and still, every single Wednesday morning at precisely 9 o'clock, doing her own grocery shopping on Main Street, though these days it takes her considerably longer than it used to, because half the town stops her to talk now, not out of curiosity about her fortune, but out of the specific ordinary affection a town develops for someone who has become, undeniably, one of its own. She still keeps the barn locked, out of habit more than necessity at this point, and still spends her Saturday mornings teaching my son the difference between a load-bearing joint and a decorative one, and still, every single time I see her, greets me with some version of the same dry, precise warmth that first told a grieving 22-year-old standing at the bottom of a ladder in the rain that his father would be proud of him. I think about that sentence often. Still, all these months later, your father would be proud of you, Cole, because I understand now, in a way I could not have understood at 22, that she was not simply offering comfort to a grieving young man that day. She was making, quietly, the very first entry in a decision she would spend the next 18 years slowly confirming, storm season after storm season, that this particular young man, whatever else became of him, was the kind of person worth eventually trusting with everything she had left to give. I did not know, climbing that ladder in the rain, that I was being watched, tested, considered, quietly and patiently, the way her own quiet observation of me across 18 years of storms was its own kind of careful, patient engineering, checking the load, checking the joints, making sure the structure would actually hold before she ever trusted it with the full weight of what she had left to leave behind. I want to end this the way Miriam ended our conversation on the drive home from the old Halcyon facility, because I have not been able to improve on it in the months since, and I do not think I ever will. She said, "Cole, I spent my whole professional life believing that the most important work in the world happened in laboratories and control rooms and boardrooms, the visible, celebrated, photographed kind of work, and it took me losing Walter, and 30 years of quiet hiding in a farmhouse at the end of a dirt road, and finally 18 years of watching an ordinary young man climb a ladder for free in every kind of weather this state can produce. To understand that the actual load-bearing structure of a good life, or a good town, or a good marriage, or a good anything at all, is never the visible part. It is the part underneath, the part nobody photographs, the part that only ever gets tested when the storm actually comes and holds or doesn't, based entirely on whether somebody built it with real care back when nobody else was watching. I think, in the end, about the specific shape of an ordinary week in Ashworth Hollow now, because I think it says more about how this story actually settled than any single dramatic scene could. A Tuesday morning starts with my mother teaching a half-dozen retirees how to safely rewire a table lamp in the Grange Hall's side room, Donna's fix-it hour in full swing, coffee percolating in a machine considerably newer than Miriam's, but somehow always tasting a little like hers anyway. Renee spends her mornings at the Trust's small office above the hardware store, reviewing applications with the same careful attention she once gave to shelving returned library books, matching a 19-year-old welder in the next county over with a master electrician 3 towns past that who's agreed to take on an apprentice. I spend my days largely the way I always have, ladders and shingles and storm windows, except now with Wesley or Priya beside me more often than not, teaching them the same unhurried attention to the work underneath the visible repair that I once learned, without ever being told directly, from watching my own father, and that I now understand, having heard the whole story. I was also quietly learning from Miriam the entire time. 18 years of demonstration disguised as simple gratitude. Tucker and Bertie spend their Saturday mornings at the farmhouse at the end of Larkspur Road, one building bridges, the other supervising a barn cat with the total seriousness only a 6-year-old can bring to that particular job, and Miriam spends her Wednesday mornings exactly where she has spent them for 30 years, doing her own grocery shopping on Main Street, though these days the trip takes considerably longer, filled with conversations she once would have avoided and now, visibly, looks forward to. And every few weeks, when the forecast turns the specific shade of gray that used to mean I was climbing a ladder for free, I still drive out to Larkspur Road anyway, not for the roof anymore. That debt, if it ever really was one, has been settled for a long time now, but simply because 18 years built something in me that doesn't know how to stay away when a storm is coming, and someone I love is at the end of that road, and I don't imagine that particular habit is one I'll ever fully retire. Nor would I want to. I want to say clearly, before I close this out, that none of what I've told you happened because Miriam Voss was secretly waiting to reward the right person for good behavior. The way some people hear stories like this one and assume that must be the mechanism underneath it. She told me herself, more than once, that she never once thought of those 18 years as a test with a prize waiting at the end. She thought of them, for most of that time, simply as the ordinary, unremarkable comfort of having one reliable person in her life who showed up regardless of weather, and it was only very late, only in the last year or two before she finally told me the truth. that she began to understand what that reliability might actually be worth to pass on, not as a reward for me specifically, but as a structure that could outlast both of us and keep doing. For strangers, neither of us will ever meet. Exactly what showing up for each other had quietly done for our own two families. I have also come to understand in the months since that Miriam's choice of me specifically was never really about singling out one uniquely deserving person in an entire town full of ordinary people. And I think it's important to say that clearly, because I don't want anyone hearing this story to walk away believing I was some singular exception in Ashworth Hollow. Warren Kettle has extended credit at his hardware store to families going through hard stretches for 30 years without ever once making a show of it. Mrs. Okafor spent 4 years advocating, unpaid and mostly unnoticed, for a shop program the school board had already written off, simply because she believed the kids who needed it deserved someone still fighting for them. Curtis's own uncle at the auto shop has quietly covered repair costs for elderly customers on fixed incomes more times than anyone in town could count. I was never the only person in Ashworth Hollow who might have passed whatever quiet test Miriam was running. I simply happened to be the one whose particular kindness intersected with her particular grief and her particular roof, at the particular moment in her life when she was finally ready to let someone in. That accident of timing and geometry matters to me more now than it did at the start, because I think it means the actual lesson of this story isn't that extraordinary reward eventually finds extraordinary people. It's that this town, this unremarkable stretch of mountain road most people driving through would never look at twice, is quietly full of exactly the kind of decency this story turned out to be about. And I got to be the one standing on the ladder when it mattered. That's closer to the truth than any story about me being special. And I think Miriam, who spent her whole career being underestimated and then spent 30 years deliberately going unnoticed by choice, would want that part said plainly, more than any other part of what I've told you today. There is a particular quiet that settles over Larkspur Road in the last hour before a storm arrives. The kind of stillness where the leaves flip pale side up and every dog in the county goes restless at once. And I still feel something specific happen in my chest every single time I notice it. Some old, practiced readiness that 18 years built into me so thoroughly it will probably outlast the actual need for it by decades. I mentioned that to Miriam once this past September, sitting on her porch watching exactly that kind of sky roll in over the ridge, and she said, without looking away from the clouds, "Cole, I have spent my whole life around people who could calculate the load tolerance of nearly anything you handed them, and it took me 80 years to meet someone who simply feels a storm coming and moves toward the person who might need him rather than away from the risk. And I want you to know that of every system I ever designed, every calculation I ever ran, watching you do that, plainly without any instruments at all, has taught me more about what actually holds a life together than any of it ever did." I did not have a clever answer for that sitting beside her on that porch, so I simply reached over and refilled her coffee, the way I imagine I will keep doing for as long as she'll let me, and we sat there together, quiet. Watching the storm finally arrive over the ridge the way storms always eventually do in that part of Vermont, and I thought, not for the first time, and probably not for the last, that some of the most important structures in a person's life are never the ones you set out deliberately to build. They are the ones that simply accumulate, one ordinary Saturday at a time, one ladder, one storm, one unhurried kitchen table conversation at a time, until one day you look back and realize the whole thing has been quietly load-bearing for years, holding up more weight than you ever knew it was carrying, exactly the way Miriam Voss once designed a landing system to carry a spacecraft safely home, except this one, built out of nothing more sophisticated than 18 years of simply choosing, storm after storm, to show up. Renee asked me recently, half joking, half not, whether I thought Tucker would end up an engineer or a handyman when he finally grew up, as though the two things were separate destinations rather than two ends of the same road. And I told her I honestly didn't care which one he chose, because I've come to believe, after everything this past year taught me, that the actual distinction was never the one I used to think it was. It was never about which side of a blueprint you stand on, the drafting table or the ladder, the boardroom or the pickup truck. It was only ever about whether you show up when the thing you're responsible for actually needs you, in the exact weather that makes showing up hard, and whether you keep showing up long after anyone would blame you for stopping. Miriam Voss learned that lesson the hardest possible way at 37 years old, standing in a review room explaining why her husband's descent module had failed. I learned a smaller, gentler version of the same lesson on a ladder in the rain at 22, the day I buried my father. And I hope, more than almost anything else I could wish for my own children, that whichever road they eventually choose, drafting table or ladder, they learn it a little sooner and a little more gently than either of us did. That, more than the trust, more than the scholarships, more than the $290 million that started all of this, is what I actually hope people take away from what happened in Ashworth Hollow this past year, if they take anything away from it at all. So the next time the sky turns that particular color over your own house, whatever town you happen to live in, and you find yourself wondering whether it's worth the trouble to check on the elderly neighbor down the road or the coworker who always seems to be struggling quietly in a way nobody else has noticed, or the stranger at the counter who's a little short on cash for reasons they'd rather not explain. I hope you remember Miriam Voss and the roof at the end of Larkspur Road, and I hope you go anyway, storm and all, expecting absolutely nothing in return, because you never really know, standing at the bottom of somebody else's ladder, exactly what kind of life you might be quietly helping to hold up. 18 years ago, I was a grieving 22-year-old climbing a stranger's roof in the rain because it was the job in front of me, and my father would have gone. I had no idea I was also, quietly, without either of us fully realizing it at the time, building the one relationship that would eventually change the shape of my entire family's future, and the future of a whole town besides. I don't say that to suggest you should go looking for some hidden reward in your own quiet kindnesses, because the moment you start looking for it, it stops being the thing that makes it worth doing in the first place. I say it only because it happened to be true in my case, and because I think it's worth remembering on the ordinary Tuesdays when showing up feels like nothing more than one more task on an already long list that you rarely get to see in the moment just how much weight a small, steady kindness is actually carrying. If you have ever quietly shown up for someone with no expectation of anything coming back, if you have ever climbed your own version of a ladder in the rain simply because somebody needed you to, I hope this story finds you today and reminds you that the ledger on kindness like that is longer than any of us can see from where we're standing, and that sometimes, though certainly not always, and never as the reason to do it in the first place, it does come back around in shapes none of us could have predicted, roofs and ladders and storm seasons folding, slowly, into something that outlasts every one of us. Miriam Voss taught me that the best kind of legacy is not the kind you build to be remembered. It is the kind you build so quietly that the person receiving it never even has to notice the size of what they were given until one day, if they're very lucky, they finally do. If this story moved you, if you believe kindness quietly practiced over years, not for reward but simply because it's who you are, is worth more than any single dramatic gesture, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel, because we bring you a new true story just like this one every single day. Stories about ordinary people who turned out, in the end, to be carrying something extraordinary all along. Leave a comment below and tell us about someone in your own life who has shown up for you again and again in ways they never expected anything back for. Because I promise you, reading through those comments is one of the best parts of sharing stories like this one. And if you know someone who needs a reminder today that the quiet, unglamorous, unwitnessed kindnesses are the ones that actually hold a life together, share this video with them. Thank you for spending this time with Cole and Miriam and the whole town of Ashworth Hollow, and we will see you in the next story.